Chapter 56. Mountain Clans. Axel goes to deal with an old mess only to find that it mostly cleaned itself up. XXX. Axel felt no guilt for what he'd done to Lisa Arryn and Petter Baelish. If anything, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, and no small amount of relief as well. After all, if he'd waited any longer to take care of things in the Vale, Nestor Royce would probably be dead. They might have stopped at just locking the High Steward in the sky cells due to his rank and reputation, but Lisa had apparently happily thrown other innocent people out the moon door. And all for the crime of daring to question her authority as her son's regent. Much longer and she would no doubt have grown emboldened enough to do such a thing to even Lord Royce as well. In the end, it would be up to Nestor and Sir Brynden to see if anything could be made of young Robert Arryn. Jon's only son was a sickly, simple-minded boy by all accounts, overly coddled and spoiled by his mother, when she wasn't secretly and spitefully wishing he had a different father, apparently. With Lisa Arryn's influence removed from the occasion, perhaps Robert Arryn still had a chance to become something more. Only time would tell on that front. As for Petter Baelish, there was no chance in the seven hells that Axel was ever going to let the man live. It didn't matter what he said, it didn't matter what he offered. Secrets and gold were meaningless in the face of the Master of Coin's treasonous acts. It was interesting to learn that Stoneheart came from Euron Greyjoy, Axel supposed. To know that the exiled Greyjoy was plotting against him for all that time was strange. Why had Euron tried to help Renly win the throne? Had it simply been to make Westeros weaker for his eventual invasion? Or was there more to it than that? Axel didn't really care though, in the end. Just as he hadn't cared when Petter offered him millions of golden dragons in exchange for his life. Oh sure, Axel fully intended to pay down the debt and see the crown free of such shackles by the time he passed on and his eventual son inherited the Iron Throne, but he wouldn't do it by compromising his own values. Not even for a second. No, Baelish had to die. That was set in stone from the moment that he killed Jon Arryn. Nay, even from the moment that he first made Jon a cuckold. There was only one fate for a traitorous, self-serving bastard like Littlefinger. A fate that Axel had made sure he suffered by leaping out the moon door with him and following Petter all the way down. They said that the moon door opened to a 600-foot drop. Axel could confirm that was fairly accurate. To be fair, the likelihood of Littlefinger surviving the fall had been pretty much zero, but Axel wasn't taking any chances. Not with this. He dropped and watched Petter Baelish die. The man had exploded under him as Axel effectively rode him to the ground. He'd also confirmed Lisa Arryn's death at the bottom of the plunge as well. And then he'd climbed his way back up the sheer cliff face that the Eyrie sat on, a 100-foot leap at a time. Truthfully, it had been easy for him. Even easier than traversing the mountains of the moon had been back before he'd been legitimized and made king. He felt lighter these days, after the wildfire in King's Landing. Sometimes, he even felt like he was flying through the air. But that would be ridiculous, of course. Regardless, just because his business in the Eyrie was concluded, that didn't mean his time in the Vale was over and done with. Talking with Lord Royce had led to some interesting news, and so Axel found himself traveling to the Vale's lowlands, searching out a certain gathering. It turned out that the mountain clans had continued following his orders since he left the Vale all those months ago. They'd just chosen a rather unconventional way to go about it. To be fair, after months of tutelage under Jon and learning more things than he'd ever known before, Axel now recognized that his original orders to the mountain clans had been unintentionally cruel. The first men who inhabited the mountains of the moon did not know farming or animal husbandry, or even fishing. They were not foragers, they were raiders. They understood how to fight and how to take and not much else. When Axel came along and forced them all to acknowledge his strength and stop their raiding, he hadn't really thought about the long-term effects of what he was demanding of them. In all honesty, he was pretty sure none of them had either. But, it seemed like there had to be at least one or two intelligent men or women among the mountain clans, because rather than return to the old ways once the going got tough, they'd gone in a different direction entirely, completely without Axel's interference or involvement. Arriving outside of the encampment that the mountain clans have made in the Vale lowlands, Axel lets out a sigh as he slows down and walks more casually the rest of the way to the camp's entrance. The guards outside look him up and down with curiosity and distrust in equal measure. Who the fuck are you supposed to be? Axel just smiles. I was sent by High Steward Royce to meet with the chieftains. True, technically. But obviously he's leaving out his true identity. Still, there's a pause as the mountain warriors guarding the encampment entrance exchange looks. Finally, They grunt and one of them gestures with his head for Axel to follow him in. Axel does so, looking around curiously. This has to be the largest concentration of first men from the mountains of the moon in one place, maybe ever. They've come down from their mountains, making camp here in the lowlands, but not to raid or conquer or pillage as Axel would have thought. No, rather, they're here for something else entirely. Shaga of the Stone Crows is the first chieftain to come out, his eyes widening when he sees Axel and a big grin spreading across his face. Axel Stone, you have returned to us. And would you look at that? You've finally managed to start growing a proper beard too. His joyful exclamation causes the warrior escorting Axel to rear back and look to him in shock and surprise, having no doubt heard tales of him. At the same time, more heads poke out of tents and more mountain warriors begin to gather. Axel just smiles easily, bringing his hand up to scratch at the scruff on his face as he lets out a rueful sigh. Shaga. It's good to see you again. Though it's not Axel Stone anymore. Shaga raises a brow at that. Oh. Let's wait for the other chieftains to assemble. Grunting, Shaga shrugs. Soon, more and more mountain chieftains show up, with some having to come from far deeper in the camp once word of his presence reaches him. Not all of the leaders he remembers still live. Some have been replaced, though even the newer chieftains look at him with cautious, wary respect in their eyes. The deaths aren't that surprising, all things considered. If anything, the most surprising thing is seeing Chella, chieftain of the Black Ears, visibly pregnant. And from the way Shaga grabs her and pulls her to his side while grinning proudly as she scowls and pouts, it's obvious who put the baby in her as well. Time really does pass by, doesn't it? Axel lets out a breath, even as he looks around at everyone. So, first things first, I'm not Axel Stone anymore. I'm Axel Baratheon now. First of his name and bearer of too many titles. But most importantly, they made me king. Of the entire 7 kingdoms. Eyes widen at that. Even mountain warriors, who most of the Vale's population would deem mere savages and brutes, knew what a king was. They'd been fighting Vale kings for thousands of years before the Targaryens came along and made the title far more unique, after all. Ha! So they recognized your strength and put you in charge. Guess it makes sense, not like the Kneelers would have anyone stronger than you. Axel grins fondly at the rather simplistic view of things. Some of them are smarter than that, clearly recognizing that it's a lot more complicated, but Axel just shrugs, not really feeling like explaining all the details. Sure. Let's go with that. And you lot, you've certainly been busy in my absence, haven't you? The reaction there is mixed. There's a few fearful looks, a few defiant looks, and even a few ashamed looks. Shaga though holds himself tall, his head held high as he grunts and pulls Chella a little bit closer. We adapted, just like you wanted us to. There's a note of challenge in the Stone Crow chieftain's voice, as if he's daring Axel to decry their actions. But Axel just smiles and nods. You're right. You did. You've all done better than my wildest expectations. Truthfully, he hadn't put much thought into the mountain clans since leaving the Vale all those months ago. Maybe he should have, but he supposed he expected a letter from High Steward Royce to arrive if there were any problems, and that had never happened. Instead, the mountain clans had taken matters into their own hands, and started selling themselves as protectors to the villages of the lowlands, rather than raiding and pillaging them as they'd done in the past. It was actually rather ingenious for so-called savages. There were dozens of mountain clans after all, and at least a dozen large clans, with Axel having only really beaten down and united the majority under himself before leaving. The majority, but not all of them. And beyond that, there were far more dangers in the mountains of the moon than just the mountain clans too. From big predators to landslides and even sometimes avalanches, there were many threats that the lowland villages could suffer from, all things considered. That was what the mountain clans that Axel had subjugated had ultimately banked on. They had approached the village headmen and made deals with each and every one of them. In exchange for payment in the form of resources and goods, the mountain clans would defend them from rogue mountain warriors and other threats. When Nestor heard of this, he'd taken a collection of Vale knights and rode out to see what exactly was going on and if anyone was being taken advantage of. However, remembering what Axel had told him, Nestor had been cautious and even willing to give the mountain clans the benefit of the doubt, and that apparently had made all the difference. In the end, the mountain chieftains had made a deal with Lord Royce himself, and from what Axel had been told, they'd actually been upholding their end of the bargain. They fended off wild animals, they helped out during natural disasters, and they'd even been responsible for retrieving more than one lost child who would otherwise have died and returning them to their homes. It was impressive, no, more than impressive, it was beyond anything Axel would have thought possible. They'd really outdone themselves. The mountain chieftains look a strange mix of pleased, proud, and generally uncertain in the face of his positive reinforcement. In the end, Shaga just grunts and grins. Hey, so that's why you came all the way down here, huh? Just to tell us you're not going to slaughter us all today. Or did you miss having men who could give you a real fight? We could arrange for a wrestle right now, if you like. Shaga flexes his free arm even as Chella rolls her eyes and the others watching on hoot and holler in excitement. Axel finds himself smiling wider still, the excitement more than a little infectious. For a moment, he's very tempted to say yes, for a moment, he's able to forget everything that brought him here. But then it all comes crashing back down and his smile drops as he lets out a sigh and shakes his head. I'm afraid there's another reason I'm here, Chieftain Shaga. Sweeping his gaze around the assembled warriors surrounding him on all sides, Axel lifts his voice. I may be king of the 7 kingdoms, but one of my kingdoms has decided to rebel against me. The Ironborn of the Iron Islands have risen up against me and their ruler has crowned himself king and named himself my equal, my rival. They might not understand everything, but they definitely understand that last bit. Axel brings his hands together, smacking a fist into a palm as he bares his teeth. I'm going to show him how wrong he is. My armies assemble even now to take the fight to the Ironborn. But since I was in the Vale on other business, I thought to myself, who are the greatest warriors in all the world? Who do I know that deserves to be involved in such an amazing battle, and reap all the rewards that will come from fighting alongside me? Understanding dawns on more and more faces as even the dimmest of the mountain warriors start to pick up on what Axel is saying. The assembled men get more and more excited by the moment. Chuckling, Axel spreads his arms wide. What say you, warriors of the mountains? What say you, men and women of the moon? Will you venture out with me? Will you go to war with me? He might as well have asked them if they wanted to get drunk and feast with him. A veritable roar of approval builds up from all around him and Axel just chuckles as weapons are raised into the air and howls of bloodlust echo through the area. Axel knows he's talking them all up a bit, admittedly. But he also knows that this right here was the absolute best way he could reward them all for sticking to their pact with him all this time. He could give them more gold than they would ever know what to do with, but they wouldn't appreciate it, not really. The mountain clans craved battle after all, and this way they could take spoils from the Ironborn instead of the innocent people of the Vale. It was a win-win situation, really. Once the clamor has died down a bit, Axel speaks once more. I see I have your approval. Then prepare to move out. We will leave through the Bloody Gate and join with the rest of my armies to the south. He'd told Sir Bryden as much, making sure the Blackfish went ahead to prepare his garrison for the oncoming exodus of the mountain clans. Axel would lead the mountain clans as far as the King's Road before going on ahead back to King's Landing. They could catch up from there. Many would likely return to the Vale eventually, some would not. Some would fall in battle, while still more would be rewarded with riches beyond their wildest imaginations wherever Axel could find a moment to do so. To be fair, it was better than his first instinct, all the way back when he'd initially arrived at the Bloody Gate. When he'd thought that Sir Brynden might be in on it, that the rot went as deep as the bone marrow, and didn't know whether Nestor Royce still lived or not. Axel had briefly considered whether he was going to leave the area in the hands of the mountain clans by the time he was done excising the infection. Simply because everyone else who held a claim to the Vale might be dead by his hands at that point. Fortunately, it didn't seem like it was going to come to that. The Vale would recover from Littlefinger's manipulations and Lisa Arryn's treachery. And the 7 kingdoms would not fall to Euron Greyjoy's ambitions. Not while Axel Baratheon still drew breath. XXX. Next time, back to King's Landing. Chapter 57. Welcome back. Sansa and Arianne are waiting when Axel finally returns to King's Landing. XXX. Sansa could hardly believe it when they found out that Axel had left the city just after they'd come to terms with one another. He'd just suffered more pain and agony than most men could ever hope to survive, and yet, he was gone, just like that. If it wasn't for Stannis Baratheon having a brand new hand of the Kingpin and Lord Commander Aris Oakheart backing up his claims that Axel had left the city voluntarily, Sansa wasn't sure she would have trusted it. Hell, if the king had stayed gone for too long, she and the others probably would have decided it was a lie after all. And then they might have done something inadvisable. Luckily, Axel was already back just a few days later. He was back, and Sansa and Arianne were prepared for his return. Through some maneuvering, they managed to get the king alone with them. Well, alone with them, Tyene Sand, and Marjorie Tyrell. The look of surprise on Axel's face is rather amusing as he realizes all four women are in the room together and none of them are at each other's throats. Then, it falls away to suspicion, his eyes narrowing as he looks to each of them. Should I be worried about whatever this is? Giggling, Ariane shakes her head. The opposite. You should be thrilled, seeing as we've reached an understanding with one another. Something you'd already know if you hadn't disappeared for days like you did. The Dornish princess softens the words with her smile and a rueful shake of her head, but Sansa can hear the very real reproach in Ariane's tone all the same. Frankly, she can't help but agree with it. After everything he'd been through, to just vanish like that. Axel at least has the good grace to look chagrined as he chuckles and shakes his head. Apologies. I had business in the Vale. Then, he looks to Sansa and winces. I'm sorry, Sansa. Lisa Arryn had to be put to death alongside Petyr Baelish for their shared crimes against the Seven Kingdoms. Sansa blinks, caught flat-footed by the news. Her aunt had been involved in everything. Admittedly, Sansa hadn't even met the other woman until she'd arrived here to King's Landing. And even that had been one single encounter arranged by her mother before Sansa had decided not to involve herself any further with Lisa. Still, she wouldn't have thought her to be a traitor. Not Lord Baelish either. They'd met once or twice as well and he'd seemed rather kind and personable. Not to mention, Sansa was pretty sure Petyr Baelish had owed every ounce of his success to Jon Arryn. Still, if Axel was telling the truth, and she believed he was, then, well, they'd gotten what was coming to them, hadn't they? There's nothing to apologize for, Your Grace. They faced the king's justice and from the sound of it, rightly so. Axel smiles softly and inclines his head, clearly grateful that she's not upset with him. The mood in the room is a little somber for a moment, until Marjorie speaks up. Hold on. You were only gone for 3 days, Your Grace. Are you saying you went all the way to the Vale and then came back that quickly? Sansa's eyes widen slightly and she sees Ariane's do the same as they both realize Marjorie is right. How had Axel covered such distances in so little time? It seemed impossible. But Axel just nods, solemn-faced. I did, yes. I won't hide any more, so you might as well all know, I'm no mere man. His declaration is met with raised eyebrows rather than expressions of shock. They'd all already known that, after all. Axel Baratheon had been doused in wildfire and burned for 7 days before recovering completely, after all. And yet, Sansa still lets out a little gasp of astonishment when he suddenly vanishes from view only to reappear on the other side of them all, moving like a blur across the span of the room in less than a second. Looking hesitant as they stare at him in wide-eyed, open-mouthed shock, Axel just shrugs his shoulders. I can't really explain it, I'm afraid. You do not need to explain it, Your Grace. You have been blessed by the Seven. You are their vessel in the physical world, sent to lead us into a brighter future. Sansa's eyes shift towards Tyene Sand, as do everyone else's. Admittedly, Sansa hadn't had many chances to interact with Tyene before the wildfire explosion, but from what Marjorie had told her, the Dornish woman had changed after it. Ever since Axel had survived his brush with death, Tyene had been different. More focused. More zealous. Axel just smiles weakly and nods his head. That's one possibility, yes. Silence falls again, until finally Axel turns and gazes at them inquisitively. What did you mean earlier, exactly? What did you mean when you said that you reached an understanding? Finally, Sansa straightens up, while Ariane glances her way and smiles. They step closer to one another, and reach out to take hold of each other's hands. Exactly what it sounds like, Your Grace. We're not worried about competing with one another anymore. There are more important things in life. And neither of us wants to burden you unduly either, given everything that's happening. So, simply put, we're fine with whichever of us you choose to be your queen. Axel's eyes are wide as Ariane's tone turns sultry and she steps forward, closer to the king while Sansa does the same at her side. And, we just hope you won't mind us both sticking around, no matter who you choose. Because we're in agreement that whoever you don't choose will be just as happy serving beneath her king and queen, in whatever manner you see fit. Sansa can't quite help the blush that comes over her cheeks as Axel's eyes dart between her and the seductress at her side. Still, now that Ariane's part of the spiel is done, it's Sansa's turn. To that end, Your Grace, I would offer you my maidenhead, right here and now. Not so that you will choose me over the princess, but so that the two of us will be on even ground with one another. No matter what happens, so long as you still want us, neither of us are going anywhere. Axel doesn't respond. He seems to be frozen in place, staring at the two of them in disbelief. Of course, seeing how he's not rejecting them outright, Sansa and Arianne mutually decide to move on with the next part of the plan. Namely, they let go of one another and Sansa steps back while Arianne steps forward. As the Princess of Dorne pulls down the top of her dress, exposing her large dusky breasts and dropping down to her knees, Marjorie and Tyene silently move to Sansa, their hands gliding over her body as they both play their part in this entire performance. It's not long before Arianne has Axel's cock out and has wrapped her breasts around his length. And a moment later, she goes a step further by lowering her mouth to swallow the head of his member betwixt her lips. Once upon a time, Sansa had been envious of Arianne's chest size, and angry that her bust seemed to draw Axel's eye so well. Now though, that very same bosom is being used to prepare him for what's to come, the princess slowly and steadily bringing the king to full mast, his cock growing harder, thicker, longer, and straighter by the second. All the while, Axel's eyes are on Sansa. He's locked gazes with her and can't seem to look away, especially as Tyene and Marjorie play their parts by moving to strip Sansa naked and begin preparing her for his cock. To be fair, Sansa finds that she can't look away either. Even as her pale figure is revealed inch by inch, even as the other two women dance their mouths and hands across her flesh, Sansa stares into Axel Baratheon's stormy blue eyes. Fingers delve between her legs, finding her sex and playing with it as Sansa moans. At the same time, Axel grunts, a hand coming down to rest atop Arianne's head as he clearly finds her technique to be quite enjoyable. Truthfully, Sansa isn't sure how long this part of it lasts. Seconds. Minutes. Hours. She loses herself in Axel Baratheon's eyes and is only pulled from her pleasurable stupor when Arianne finally pulls back and reveals his spit-polished, throbbing member. You're both ready now. Claim her, my king. Claim her as you've claimed us all. At Arianne's urging, Axel moves towards the bed. Tyene and Marjorie pull away, leaving Sansa alone as the king of the Seven Kingdoms climbs atop her. Sansa's breath hitches and she spreads her legs for Axel, welcoming him with open arms as well. His lips press against her lips and she wraps her arms around his neck as she moans into his mouth. His chest brushes against her nipples, teased and hardened as they are by Marjorie and Tyene's efforts. The contact sends shivers of delight through Sansa's body, even as she feels the throbbing head of his member press against her slit down below. She's so very aroused for him. But then to be fair, this was all her idea. Coming together and joining forces might have been Arianne's plan, but it was Sansa who had decided she would give up her maidenhead to seal the deal, so to speak. Nobody outside of this room was likely to approve if they found out, of course. But Sansa didn't really care anymore. She knew what she wanted. She knew what she needed, and it was right here, between her legs. Axel finally thrusts in and Sansa cries out, only for her voice to be swallowed up by his lips as they continue to kiss. She clings to him all the harder even as he claims her right there on the spot. The pain is surprisingly fleeting. She's certainly expecting it to hurt more, but it would seem she will owe Arianne, Marjorie, and Tyene her thanks after this is done. The princess had assured her that losing one's virginity did not have to hurt and that preparations could be taken beforehand. Marjorie had agreed in a rare show of solidarity, but Sansa hadn't fully believed them until now. Together, Tyene and Marjorie had prepared her just as Arianne had prepared Axel, and the end result is that the pleasure completely overtakes the pain within moments. As Axel begins to fuck her, Sansa finds herself grateful to the other women for another bit of information they'd so graciously given her as well. Namely, that sex with Axel Baratheon was unlike anything she could possibly prepare herself for. Both Marjorie and Arianne had made it clear that he would bring her to the heights of ecstasy and bliss and leave her desperately wanting more by the time he was through. To be fair, Sansa had been able to experience that vicariously through the expressions that Marjorie's pretty face had contorted into as Axel fucked the Tyrell woman from behind during their encounters with one another. She'd watched as Marjorie came upon his cock again and again throughout those deliciously depraved meetings. Sansa had just always assumed that it was as much Marjorie as it was Axel. But no, it was all Axel. As he fucks her into the bed, Sansa's eyes go crossed and her moans grow in volume only to continue to be stifled by Axel's mouth and tongue. The pleasure is beyond the northern lady's wildest reckoning, and she loses track of time again as he pounds her into the mattress beneath them. In and out, she doesn't want it to end, but at the same time, it feels truly endless. He feels so good inside of her that Sansa can hardly believe she held off for this long. And for what? So she could deprive herself of this pleasure, of this connection. For a brief moment, Sansa wonders if she might have been able to convince Axel to choose her far earlier if she'd only been willing to give up her maidenhead sooner. But as swiftly as that thought comes, Sansa discards it. It doesn't matter anymore. None of it matters as much as this pleasure. As the red-haired Stark tosses her head back in ecstasy, she knows she's made the right decision by teaming up with Princess Arianne. Because no matter who becomes Axel's queen, she doesn't ever want this pleasure to end. She doesn't ever want to lose access to the king and his big, fat, cock. Finally, in a bit of a daze, Sansa feels Axel pull out of her. She's vaguely aware as Marjorie and Tyene get to take his load all across their waiting faces and breasts. And she's also vaguely aware as Axel, brutish man that he is, growls and grabs Arianne, throwing her down next to Sansa and fucking her right after. Arianne had explained that the king was insatiable. How he regularly exhausted her and Tyene even when they were pulling out all the stops and using every last trick that they knew. But Sansa had never truly experienced that because she and Marjorie had never truly tried to find Axel's limits. She experiences it now though. All four of them do. It continues on for quite some time, probably hours, before it's over at long last. Sansa is unbelievably sore by that point, yet also utterly satiated as well. The others must feel the same way, because when Axel lays down among them, they don't hesitate to cuddle up with him. Sansa finds herself curling into his body on his right, while Arianne takes up the same position on his left. Marjorie and Tyene, meanwhile, lay between his legs and nurse his cock in a rather lewd, debauched manner, but one that Sansa has to admit, fits their role in all of this to a T. Finally though, the five of them relax. Sansa can barely keep her eyes open, but she nevertheless hears Axel clearly when he finally speaks. You all should know that I also fucked Asha Greyjoy. It was only one time, before I knew who she was and before she knew who I was. There's a pause as Sansa digests that information. Arianne is the one who speaks first though, and strangely enough, it's like she doesn't even care about the copulation. Instead, she's far more focused on Asha's loyalty. Do you think she's in league with her uncle? Do you think she was sent here to spy on you? But Axel shakes his head. No, from what I've been told, she claims she was here in King's Landing in the first place hunting down rumors of Euron for her father. I'm inclined to believe her. I don't think she's an enemy, I just don't want to keep any secrets from either of you. That brings a smile to Sansa's face, and Arianne's as well. They share another glance before Arianne chuckles throatily. Bedding snakes, dire wolves, flowers, and now krakens. You truly are your father's son, my king. Axel flushes and huffs. But Arianne isn't done with her teasing, a glint in her eyes as she licks her lips. I wouldn't mind sampling a bit of kraken myself sometime, honestly. And to be quite frank, I don't really care if you sleep with her again, so long as she's not diseased. Sansa raises an eyebrow, while Axel looks at Arianne in disbelief. What? Really? Rolling her eyes, Arianne runs a hand down his chest as she lets out a defeated sigh. You're too much for any one woman to handle, Axel Baratheon. Even all four of us together and you're not remotely winded, are you? I'm not. HMPH. You could have tried to lie, you know. Still, so long as you're not planning to make her your queen, I don't really care if you fuck her or not. What do you say, Sansa? TCH. Arianne was still playing games, it seemed. Though they were more lighthearted now at least. But honestly, the more she thought about it, the more she realized Arianne was right. Axel Baratheon was insatiable. Even all four of them together hadn't been able to truly exhaust him. Meanwhile, she was going to be sore for days. What was one more woman in all of that? Though, like the princess said, I don't care so long as you don't make her queen over one of us. Chuckling in disbelief as he looks between them both, Axel shakes his head. No, I won't be making her queen. Really, what I have to decide is whether she or her brother Theon are going to rule the Iron Islands after I'm done, if I don't just wipe out the Ironborn entirely. A shiver runs down Sansa's back at the casual mention of such a slaughter. Axel sounds reluctant to do it but also like he's still very much considering it. Arianne though, just laughs. Even better. Make her their leader and then knock her up a few times. Make her heir your blood and maybe the Ironborn won't try rebelling again for a few generations. Sansa's eyes widen at that, but before she can say anything, Axel is already shaking his head. That doesn't sound like a very good idea at all, princess. I don't want to give the Ironborn a claim to the Iron Throne, after all. Arianne pouts, even as Sansa feels relieved that she doesn't have to be the one to point out the obvious flaws in her new compatriot's idea. Silence falls between them all for a moment as Axel looks at them both with fondness in his eyes. Until finally, the smile on his face drops and he scowls angrily. I can't decide. Even now, even with the two of you fine with whatever choice I make, I don't want to choose between you. It's not fair. Blinking, Sansa tilts her head, a little amused by just how petulant Axel sounds. He's the most powerful man in the entirety of the Seven Kingdoms, after all. And she's never heard him whine before. It's kind of cute, honestly. On the other side of their king, Arianne giggles, clearly in agreement with Sansa on that front. Life often isn't fair, my king. She runs a hand down his chest, clearly intending to say more, but before she can, Tyene pokes her head up from between Axel's legs. The king is right. He shouldn't have to choose. All eyes turn towards the rather odd woman, but Tyene is undaunted as she stares right up at Axel. You are blessed by the seven. You are more than a mere man. House Targaryen was allowed to practice their own ways under the faith's doctrine of exceptionalism for more than 2 centuries. Why shouldn't you be allowed to have your own doctrine of exceptionalism? Why shouldn't you be allowed to have more than one queen? Judging by the surprise in Arianne's eyes when they share a look across Axel's chest, the princess wasn't expecting her handmaiden to suggest this either. Axel, meanwhile, is quietly contemplative for a second. And then, she's right. Sansa and Arianne look up to see Axel smiling down at them, suddenly looking far less stressed and so much more content. I'll marry you both. Brow furrowing, Sansa isn't opposed to the idea. At the same time though, she knows many others will be. Most of all. Will the faith go along with this? Will the High Septon and the most devout not object? But Axel is already shaking his head before she's even done speaking. They won't deny me this. Not after everything. I'll speak to the High Septon myself. And we won't have the wedding until after I've dealt with Euron Greyjoy. That's when we'll announce it. Once Euron is dead and the Iron Islands are pacified, nobody in the Seven Kingdoms will be in a mood to deny me anything. His happiness is infectious as he pulls them both closer and grins. Sansa finds herself smiling along with him, and when she meets Arianne's eyes, the Princess of Dorne is smiling too. It might not have been the outcome that either of them expected, but they certainly weren't complaining. XXX. A.N. Tyene. Por qué no los dos? Chapter 58. The Funeral. A.N. Jon Arryn's funeral. XXX. Funerals for those of high nobility in King's Landing were quite the grandiose affairs. First, the bodies were tended to and prepared by the Silent Sisters. Then, they were laid atop an altar in the center of the Great Sept of Baelor, with the deceased positioned so that the head was pointed towards the back of the statue of the stranger. If they were male, then their hands were positioned clasping a sword laid upon their chest that pointed down towards their feet. Meanwhile, 2 funeral stones painted to resemble open eyes were put over their closed lids. The symbolism was supposed to remind the living that death was just the next step. Basically, you closed your eyes in one world and opened them again in the afterlife. Meanwhile, men of Jon Arryn's stature and wealth could usually afford to have their corpses embalmed to slow the process of decay down. This apparently involved removing the internal organs likely to decay the most quickly and placing them in 7 ceremonial vases at the foot of the body. Finally, the body would sit in the Great Sept for 7 days and 7 nights, tended by members of the faith of varying degrees of seniority depending on just who the deceased was. This was how most funerals for someone like the hand of the king would go in a place like King's Landing. But of course, the vast majority of that could not be applied to Jon Arryn. There was no body for the Silent Sisters to tend to. There was nothing to clean up. No hands to clasp a sword, no eyes to cover with painted stones. No organs to extract and put in vases. Jon Arryn, much like Varys the Spider and Grandmaster Pycelle, had been reduced to naught but ash. To their credit, the High Septon and the most devout still gave it their best go. There was a casket placed on the altar in the center of the Great Sept instead, said to contain the Lord Hand's ashes. Of course, Axel knew better. The wildfire in the small council room had burned, and it had burned long. By the time the green flames finally went out, everything was pretty much unrecognizable. Sure, one could point to the part of the room where Jon had been sat and say, those must be his ashes, but the truth was, the ashes of all 3 men, as well as the rest of the room, had long commingled by the time anything had been gathered up. It was just one of the many indignities and injustices regarding Jon's death that Axel had to stomach. After all, what good would it do to throw a tantrum about the contents of a casket now? No, better to just swallow the lie and send the casket on to the Eyrie once these 7 days in the Great Sept were over. In the end, Axel would take some solace in knowing at least a small part of Jon would be buried with his ancestors. 7 of the most devout, veiled so that their true identities are hidden and they might best embody the 7 who are one, suddenly enter the main chamber and begin to perform their daily rites, moving around the altar where Jon's casket is placed and speaking in unison with one another. Axel watches from an alcove nearby, though he doesn't actually listen too closely. He's heard them do this enough by this point. Meanwhile, even as they're performing the ritual, he feels a presence come up behind him and step into place at his side. Your Grace. Looking to Stannis Baratheon, Axel nods his head in acknowledgement. Lord Hand. Stannis is quiet for a moment out of respect for Jon Arryn. But in the end, Axel's new hand is not the type to mince words. Lannisport has fallen and Castle Rock is under siege. They say Sir Kevin Lannister was slain in battle trying to hold the city. There are also rumors that Euron Greyjoy commands a monstrous kraken said to be large and powerful enough to destroy the city's walls. Axel processes this for a moment, breathing in and then out. Finally, he turns to fully look at his uncle. Rumors. Stannis grimaces. The sources are reputable. The news is just hard to swallow. Yes, Axel imagines the sources would be reputable. After all, it wasn't like they really had access to disreputable sources anymore, not with Varys' death. All of his so-called little birds had gone to ground, disappearing into Flea Bottom or maybe the depths of the Red Keep's tunnels. Axel didn't really know where they'd gone or what they were doing with the death of the spider. He just knew that any and all information coming to them these days would likely be official correspondence via ravens for the foreseeable future. At least until another master of whispers could be found. You had best learn to swallow even the strangest news, uncle. If someone like me can exist, then I should think a particularly massive kraken wouldn't be nearly as far-fetched. It would explain how Euron Greyjoy was able to take over the Iron Islands without them holding one of their kingsmoots, after all. Stannis inclines his head in acknowledgement, before scowling. You're right. It would also explain why he acted so brashly. When his brother Balon declared his independence, he did so by burning the Lannister fleet first and then announcing himself king. But Euron wanted the Lannisters to pull their fleet back to Lannisport. Axel raises an eyebrow, prompting Stannis to elaborate further. He wanted them to leave the rest of the coast undefended so that he could continue raiding the fishing villages all up and down it. Plus, it allowed him to smash their fleet to pieces in one fell swoop. And a kraken of the size being reported would make the latter task all too easy. Yes, that made sense. It's good to see that Stannis still has all the sense of a man who knew his way around naval warfare. Unfortunate then, what Axel was going to have to do. You'll be staying in King's Landing when I depart with our armies. Stannis stiffens, but Axel continues on unabated. Lord Seaworth will command the royal fleet and take it southward to eventually link up with the Redwyne fleet at the Arbor, assuming they're still intact by then. I will take our armies overland to the Westerlands and we'll either relieve the siege on Castle Rock or take back the castle if it's already fallen. Sighing, Axel waves a hand through the air. From there, we'll smash whatever Ironborn remain in Lannisport, kill this kraken if it shows up, and head for the Iron Islands to finish this once and for all. But you, I need you here, uncle. Acting as my hand and regent while I'm gone. He waits for Stannis to argue. To his surprise, the dour man eventually bows his head. As my king commands. Axel considers that for a moment. If it were Jon, he might have tried harder to make sure that the older man knew he meant no insult by it. But then, if it were Jon, Axel wouldn't have had to worry about an unintended insult anyways. Jon Arryn would have understood, but also, Jon Arryn had been an old man. His days of war were long behind him. Stannis was, not young, but still young enough to fight. Unfortunately, Axel needed him more here than he needed him by his side in the coming war. Fortunately, it seems that his new hand cares more for duty than glory. In that way, Stannis and Jon were quite a lot alike. How go the preparations for the royal fleet anyways? Are Davos and our ships going to be ready in a timely manner? Straightening up, Stannis nods sharply. Yes. Everything is moving without delay. They'll be ready to depart for the Arbor as soon as possible. Good. Very good. For a long moment, Axel stares out at the casket upon the altar. The most devout who had been performing their rites are finished by now and have left the main chamber at this point. Stannis doesn't leave though. He remains, until finally he speaks his mind. Will you consider marrying before you leave for war, Your Grace? Having a queen, and potentially one pregnant with your heir ahead of your departure would go a long way to securing the realm in your absence. Axel smiles softly. Now this felt like something Jon would have said. And if it were Jon standing beside him now, Axel might have even caved. But, no. He's made his decision and he's sticking to it. I will not. The wedding will take place when I return. Stannis stiffens up beside him. His tone, when he finally speaks again, is actually hopeful. You've made your choice then. Hesitating, Axel considers holding off from telling the other man for now. He knows Stannis won't approve. Jon wouldn't have either. But, Axel doesn't care. And besides, he doesn't like the thought of keeping secrets. Not from his hand. Yes, I have. I've chosen both of them. Once I'm done putting Euron Greyjoy down like the mad dog he is, I will return and marry Lady Sansa Stark and Princess Arianne Martell. They will both be queen. The hand of the king goes absolutely still at that. Axel isn't surprised. This time around, Stannis can't quite hold his tongue. That doesn't surprise Axel either. Are you sure that's a wise decision, Your Grace? The Faith are not likely to be happy about such things. To say nothing of the nobility. Here, Axel allows himself to grin. On the contrary, my hand, the Faith will be quite enthused. I've already spoken to the High Septon. He agrees that if I wait until after I've won my war with Euron, when my reputation has never been greater, that the announcement, along with his and the most devout's vocal approval, will allow me to get away with quite a lot. Including taking 2 queens instead of 1. Before Stannis can muster a response, Axel continues on. It will be likened to House Targaryen's doctrine of exceptionalism, though I assure you that I have no intentions of going as far as they did. Still, Lady Sansa and Princess Arianne, I couldn't bring myself to choose between them. And they've made it quite clear they're happy to share me, as it turns out. So if the Faith are on board and the women are on board and the small folk will be on board, well, I suppose the nobility will also fall in line, won't they? Jon would have been trying to talk Axel out of this by now. He would have sounded so disappointed too. Axel can almost hear the older man's voice now, telling him how he's going too far. But Stannis Baratheon is not Jon Arryn. He will never be Jon Arryn, not really. What if you do not return from this war? Scoffing, Axel looks Stannis in the eye and raises a brow. That won't be a problem. Kraken or no Kraken, I will kill Euron Greyjoy. I will return triumphant. And I will marry my 2 queens. You don't need to worry about me and the war, uncle. The outcome has already been decided. Euron Greyjoy is a dead man walking, he just doesn't know it yet. Stannis' eyes drop down to his own sword for a moment and Axel knows he's remembering the events of the other day. Smiling slightly, Axel shakes his head, and draws Stoneheart. This causes his uncle to stiffen, but Axel just takes the Valyrian steel blade and presses it against his palm. And then, gripping it tightly, he slides his hand along the impossibly sharp edge. The other day, I showed you that normal, castle-forged steel could not cut me. As you know, on the day of the trial by the 7, Loras Tyrell managed to make me bleed with this very sword. Pulling his hand back, Axel shows it to Stannis, revealing a complete lack of injury. There's the barest hints of a thin red mark across his skin, but even that is rapidly vanishing. Not even Valyrian steel can cut me at this point, uncle. A mere kraken, no matter how large, will not be the death of me either. I'll crawl down its throat and rip it apart from the inside before I let a mere beast kill me. In the face of Stannis' silence, Axel sheathes his blade and lets out a sigh. Like I said, you needn't worry about the outcome of this war. It's already decided, even if I have to swim to the Iron Islands and slaughter every last Ironborn myself. Instead, I want you to focus on other things while I'm gone. That gets a narrow-eyed look from his hand. Such as. Looking back out at Jon's casket again, Axel hums. A new small council for one. Send a letter to the Citadel and tell them to get me a new Grandmaster as soon as their traditions allow for it. We will also need a new Master of Law to replace you and a new Master of Coin to replace Littlefinger. Another Master of Whispers would also be nice, but I'm not expecting miracles here. Work on having short lists for possible candidates drawn up by the time I return from the Iron Islands. Thinking of something else, Axel continues. Oh, and have you seized Littlefinger's brothels yet? I have. Axel smiles at his uncle's competence. Good. Have them turned over, feel free to destroy the buildings and dig a hole if you have to. Before I executed Littlefinger for his crimes, he tried to entice me into sparing his life by offering me the very gold he stole from my father back to me. That gets a scoff from Stannis and a shake of the man's head. Craven fool. Axel nods, having known that Stannis would sneer at the very thought of sparing Baelish's life. His uncle was far too stiff to even consider bending on that sort of thing. Indeed. Needless to say, I didn't take him up on his offer, but it stands to reason that at least some of that gold of his has to still be in King's Landing. Not all of it, and admittedly Baelish would have been a fool to hide any of it in his own establishments, but it's worth checking. Grunting, Stannis nods as well. Agreed, Your Grace. I'll put trusted men on it right away. Finally, his uncle turns to leave, only to pause and turn back. Axel raises a brow, wondering what it was this time. Apologies, I almost forgot. Asha Greyjoy has been asking for a meeting with you for some time now. I've been stonewalling her while also making sure to keep her and her crew in the city, just in case it turns out they were in league with Euron Greyjoy. What did you want done with them? Axel blinks, tilting his head to the side even as he considers the frankly wondrous conversation about Asha that he'd had with Sansa and Arianne just a couple days ago. Asking, not demanding. Stannis doesn't smile. He never seems to smile. But he does raise an eyebrow in response, letting Axel know exactly what form Asha's requests have taken. Grinning a little bit, Axel shakes his head. I don't think Asha Greyjoy had anything to do with her uncle's treason. But I might as well meet with her and get to the bottom of this once and for all. Thank you, uncle. That will be all. Bowing, his hand finally departs, leaving Axel to turn his attention back to Jon's casket. He stays for a little while longer and then turns and leaves. It would seem he has a kraken to pump for information before he departs on his hunt. XXX. AN. Next time, Asha. Chapter 59. Asha Greyjoy. AN. Back to Asha finally, except, and you guys aren't gonna believe me, but they don't fuck. XXX. By the time Axel finally comes to see her, Asha can't help but be a little angry that it's taken so long. At first, it was rather understandable given that he was said to be on fire there for a while. However, once he finally stopped being on fire and left the Great Sept behind, the excuses began to get downright outlandish. They claimed he was fine, while at the same time saying the strangest things about his whereabouts. I see you were finally able to make time to see me. You know they had the gall to lie to my face and say you were out of the city when I asked after you a few days ago. Chuckling, Axel shakes his head. That wasn't a lie. I really was out of the city at that time. I'm sorry I couldn't come sooner, but I had to hunt down the ones behind the wildfire attack and deal with them before they could do any more damage. Asha frowns. I suppose you succeeded then. Nodding at that, the king bares his teeth in a rather feral grin. Oh yes. They faced the king's justice, just as your uncle will, soon enough. Asha squirms, trying not to let Axel's grin get to her too much. It's been quite some time now since they fucked in that back alley, and even though she'd taken up residence in the Red Keep and they'd had a few conversations, he hadn't come to her since for another role in the sheets. It was rather frustrating, really. She'd had a good time with him that day. Almost too good if Asha was being honest. So good, in fact, that she hadn't taken another man to bed in all that time since. Normally, she would have definitely fucked someone else by now, but the very idea seemed pointless whenever she thought about it. Axel had ruined other men for her. Nobody, not even some of the men on her own crew that she'd fucked in the past, had appealed when she compared them to her experience with Axel fucking Baratheon. Still, Asha had her pride, of course. She wasn't going to go crawling to him on hands and knees and beg for another go or anything like that. Instead, she'd been waiting for him to come to her. But while they'd talked and even sparred a handful of times, there hadn't been a repeat performance. Now he stood before her somewhat different from the last time they spoke. There's something new in his eyes, and for the first time since they met, he seems to be growing a beard on that formerly clean face of his. Letting out a sigh, Asha forces her desires down into the depths of her mind and focuses instead on Axel's words rather than his handsome mug. Crossing her arms over her chest, she grunts as she looks at him a little defensively. You don't think I'm in league with my uncle, right? I know there have been some accusations bandied about. But that bastard Euron killed my father, I just know it. I would never help him with any of this. Sure, she might not have liked Balon much, in fact, she didn't like him at all. And as for love, nah, not even that. But she was still his daughter and he was still her father, and that meant something, unfortunately. She wouldn't turn on him, at least not for the exiled uncle said to be so vile that even their own people despised him. Axel spends a moment staring at her in silence, before finally cracking another smile. No, I don't think you're in league with Euron Greyjoy, Asha. Her heart flutters in her chest for a moment before she gets herself under control. Huffing, she looks to the side and scowls. Of course not. You're not an idiot. Fuck, the whole reason my father sent me to King's Landing in the first place was to find out what Euron was doing back in the area. Bastard must have slipped right past me while I was too busy chasing his tail to notice. It pissed Asha off to no end, truth be told. Here she was on the wrong side of the damn continent while Euron Greyjoy had apparently sailed the Silence all the way around the southern tip of Westeros, made for the Iron Islands, and, miraculously, showed up there the very day that Balon died and his exile was technically ended. No, Asha knew the truth. Euron had snuck either himself or some of his men onto Pike and thrown her father from the castle parapets. Made it look like Balon just had too much to drink and slipped, but Asha knew better. She fucking knew better. Oh. Is that the only reason you were sent to King's Landing? Asha blinks, freezing up at Axel's teasing tone. Flushing hotly, she scowls and glares at the handsome king. Fine. Not like it matters anymore, but yes, my father sent me to get your measure as well as find out the latest news about my uncle. I failed twice over, alright. Humming, Axel tilts his head to the side before mercifully changing the subject. They're saying that Euron Greyjoy controls a kraken. Perhaps the biggest kraken ever seen. Apparently, he used it to not only smash the entirety of the Lannister fleet but also destroy the walls of Lannisport so that the Ironborn could sack the city and lay siege to Castle Rock. That brings a grimace to Asha's face, her lips pursing. She's heard the same rumors at this point. News had been sparse for her here in the Red Keep, and she was only allowed limited contact with her crew. But still, his words match up with what she's managed to scrape together. Shoulders slumping, Asha sighs. It might be true. Would certainly explain a lot. Oh. Nodding, she elaborates. It doesn't make sense otherwise, see. My father's death and my uncle's return, that's one thing. And I can understand why the Ironborn wouldn't accept my brother Theon or me as our father's heir either. Axel grunts. And why is that? She gives him a slightly suspicious look, wondering how much he's asking just to ask and how much he already knows. But, fuck it, he was raised a bastard. Maybe he actually needs the history lesson. I'm abnormal enough as being a female captain, but there's precedent for it all the same. However, there's never been a Lady Reaper of Pike in our entire history. And Theon, you Greenlanders don't really understand how we work. Huffing, she rolls her eyes. The moment that Theon became a ward of House Stark, he became tainted in our people's eyes. Maybe if my father died before yours did and Euron didn't come back, Theon could have been put in charge of Pike, but he would never have had the respect of our people. His rule would have been a weak one. Letting out a shuddering breath, Asha continues to explain. Honestly, part of her is just glad to have someone to talk this all through with, because she's been stewing in her own thoughts for what feels like an eternity at this point. What I'm saying is that there should have been a Kingsmoot called after Euron made his claim. Probably by my other uncle, Victarion, who hates Euron's guts. The whole reason Euron was exiled by my father in the first place was because of crimes that he committed against Victarion. Axel nods along, showing that he's still listening. That's why it's ridiculous that Victarion is apparently following Euron without question and without even settling things through a Kingsmoot. Everything has moved way too fast. The only way it all makes sense is. Asha trails off, so Axel finishes her thought for her. As if the rumors of this massive, mega, kraken are real. If Euron Greyjoy showed up on Pike with the biggest kraken in the history of the Iron Islands at his back, the Ironborn wouldn't hesitate to bend the knee, would they? Even your uncle Victarion. Hesitantly, Asha nods. The kraken is our symbol of power, after all. There are stories all throughout history regarding krakens. Back when the Conqueror burned Harrenhal at Harrenhal for instance, there was a man named Lodos on the Iron Islands who claimed to be a son of the drowned god. Priests placed a crown of driftwood on his head and Lodos proclaimed that his divine father would bring forth krakens from the depths around the Iron Islands to drag down Aegon's entire fleet of warships. Asha snorts derisively and scoffs before finishing the story. Nothing happened. When the krakens failed to appear, Lodos the priest king filled his robes with stones and walked into the sea to have a chat with the drowned god. Thousands followed him into the water and their corpses were said to wash up on the shores of the Iron Islands for years afterwards. Axel's brow has lifted in a mixture of both amusement and bemusement at this story. Asha just shakes her head and gets to the point. So yes, if Euron has actually managed to tame a kraken of the size that's being reported, I could see why my people would side with him. Even Uncle Victarion wouldn't really have any room to defy him at that point. Silence falls between them as Axel processes that. She wonders what's going through the handsome man's mind. Is he losing his nerve at the thought of having to face such a beast? He can't exactly cede the entire west coast of the continent to her uncle, to be fair. The rest of the Seven Kingdoms would eat him alive. And you? Do you yearn to go and serve under Euron Greyjoy, tamer of krakens? Asha blinks, but before she can do more than start to scowl, Axel continues on. What about your crew? Would they turn on you to follow Euron? That brings her up short before she can answer the first question. She hesitates for a moment, but finally shaking her head vehemently. My crew is my crew. They'll do as I tell them to do as their captain. None of them would betray me just because my uncle commands a big fucking sea monster. And I'm not about to serve my father's killer, even if I can't prove Euron had a hand in his death. Asha wouldn't have survived this long as a captain of an Ironborn ship if she couldn't trust each and every member of her crew to the hilt. Not even her status as Balon Greyjoy's daughter could have protected her if she weren't extremely careful about who she let on her boat. After all, anything could happen out at sea and she was a woman. She had it 10 times harder than other Ironborn captain. She always had. For a long moment, Axel regards her quietly, and suddenly, it dawns on Asha why he was asking. Perking up, she grows serious as she stares into the king's eyes. Let us prove ourselves. That's what you're considering right now, right? You have the royal fleet mustering right now under your master of ships. Let me take my ship and go with them. I will fight for you in the coming war if you'll let me. Raising an eyebrow, Axel grunts. You'd follow orders. That, Asha knows he doesn't just mean his orders. Fortunately. If your master of ships were still Stannis Baratheon, I'd be a lot more reluctant to say yes. But even we Ironborn have heard of the Onion Knight. You making him the master of ships has only enhanced his legend, really. Davos Seaworth, I'd follow orders from a man like Davos Seaworth. He studies her silently before nodding again. All right then. I'll let Lord Davos know to expect you and your crew to join him on the voyage to the Arbor. Is that where they were going? Asha squirms a bit, trying not to feel too warm that Axel would trust her with such sensitive information. To be fair, it's not like it's too hard to figure out all things considered. There were only so many places that the royal fleet could reposition itself and restock after leaving this side of Westeros. And under normal circumstances, the Arbor would be safe even from Ironborn predations given the size of the Redwyne fleet. Then again, these weren't normal circumstances. Are you not worried about Euron using his Kraken to smash the Redwyne fleet at the Arbor just as he did the Lannister fleet at Lannisport? Axel frowns at that, ultimately shaking his head. It's a worry, certainly. But so far reports say that Euron's ship as well as this monstrous Kraken are holding steady at Lannisport. Maybe your uncle has become obsessed with cracking open Castle Rock and getting all the gold there or something. I honestly couldn't say, but the longer he spends in the Westerlands, the better for us all. That was true. Still, what was her uncle planning? Asha wished she knew. It couldn't just be that Euron wanted control of the Lannister gold mines. Sure, gold was always useful, but it would be hard to spend with the whole of Westeros against him. Did he perhaps hope to use Lannister gold to buy off one of the other 7 kingdoms and turn them against Axel? But no, Asha had spent her whole life being looked down on by Greenlanders for being Ironborn. Every even slightly official port they docked in, they were shunned and treated like lepers. Euron's best bet would have been to take his Kraken south to the Arbor and smash the Redwyne fleet before the royal fleet could get there. Maybe he still would, there was still time after all, but the indecisiveness and lazing about off the coast of the Westerlands didn't make sense. Then again, she hadn't understood most of how he'd managed to pull off certain things before learning about the Kraken. Ultimately Asha was forced to acknowledge that underestimating her uncle seemed like a pretty bad idea at this point. Euron must have a plan of some sort. They just didn't fully understand it yet. Still, why was he so focused on sieging Castle Rock of all places? He had to know he was needlessly giving the 7 kingdoms time to assemble their armies and move against him. Euron's machinations are unfathomable. Meanwhile, Asha hours later will realize she somehow missed yet another chance to fuck Axel. Chapter 60. The Horror. The day before Axel departs from King's Landing. The worst part was the waiting. Axel knew that everyone involved was moving as fast as they possibly could. Fleets could not be ready to set sail within a day. Armies could not be made to march within a week. And so he had to wait. Wait for messages to be traded back and forth, wait for everyone to get moving. He could have gone and tried to take care of it all himself, of course. And it was very tempting to do exactly that. Just run over to the west coast of Westeros and swim out to take down Euron Greyjoy all by himself. He was confident that he could kill the other man just as easily as he had Petyr Baelish, no matter what sort of forces Euron had on his side. However, there were a few things that held him back from doing so. First and foremost, he'd already promised the mountain clans their chance at battle back in the Vale. With the majority of their warriors having come all the way to King's Landing, it would have been something of a dick move to leave them in the lurch. Secondly, for some reason the Ironborn had only really burnt up the Westerlands at this point. There was talk of some raiding and reaving up and down the rest of the coast as well, from the Reach to the Riverlands to the north, but it was always just one ship and usually they were repelled swiftly enough. The Westerlands had suffered the brunt of the damage so far, from losing the Lannister fleet to Lannisport being burned down and Castle Rock being put under siege. And maybe it was petty of Axel, but he really didn't like Tywin Lannister. There was something to be said about not moving quite as fast as Axel personally could have after how the Lannister lord had dragged his feet during Renly's rebellion. There just wasn't a sense of urgency, truth be told. And third and finally was the Kraken that Euron was said to command. Not that the beast's presence was keeping Axel away. Actually, he really wanted to fight the massive sea monster. It was said to be bigger than multiple boats put together, and strong enough to break down city walls with just its appendages after all. The thing was, what would be the point of fighting such a thing without an audience? So yeah, Axel had his reasons for not just rushing off on his own again like he did for the Vale. But that didn't make it any easier, all this waiting. Luckily, they were almost done. Tomorrow was the day he and his armies would depart from King's Landing. But that just made these last 24 hours all the more tortuous. And so Axel found himself looking for Sandor Clegane, hoping to bully the scarred knight into a bit of a spar to take his mind off all of the waiting. Only, he was having a hard time locating the reluctant Kingsguard in any of his usual haunts. In the end, Axel was forced to go all the way to the Hound's quarters just to find the man. Marching right up to the man's door with a grin on his face, Axel doesn't bother knocking or anything like that. He just slams the door open, already shouting at the top of his lungs. Sandor, get your ass up. Your king is in need of a good. The word, fight, never leaves Axel's lips however, because he finally registers just what he's walked in on. If he'd been paying better attention and not been lost in his own thoughts, he might have heard it while he was still in the hallway. But alas, he did not. And so instead, he finds himself staring for a second in incomprehension, before his eyes widen in horror as he finally, regretfully processes what's going on in the room. As the activities inside begin to slow down at the pace of a snail to Axel's senses, he rapidly shakes his head back and forth. Never mind, pretend I was never here. And slams the door closed again, before powerwalking the fuck away before either Sandor or Brienne can get up from the bed and chase after him. Some things were never meant to be seen. Unfortunately, he'd always had a pretty good memory. His eyes were burning from the images he couldn't get out of his head. XXX. Princess. Your tits. Show me your tits immediately, it's an emergency. Arianne is lounging by herself in her quarters in one of the rare instances where she finds herself without Tyene by her side when the king comes barging in. The Dornish princess blinks owlishly at his command, taking in his stricken face. Then, with an amused giggle, she pulls down the top of her dress, letting her voluminous dusky breasts bounce free of their confines. Axel doesn't hesitate. The young king all but lunges forward and buries his face in her chest, causing Arianne to gasp in delight and then moan softly as he nuzzles her soft, sensitive breasts quite enthusiastically. Then, his mouth finds one of her nipples and Arianne's moans are no longer quite so soft as Axel starts to really get into things. They eventually move from the couch to the bed and things happen as one might expect. Axel takes to her in a frenzy, and Arianne loves every last second of it, tossing her head back in ecstasy. Eventually though, things come to their natural conclusion. The princess finds herself laying back against her pillows, her body pleasantly sore, while Axel rests his head on her chest, the young king just relaxing as she runs a hand along his scalp and across his still short hair. His hair is certainly growing back swiftly, and his stubble is beginning to form a proper beard on his face, but the wildfire was still so recent and the marks from its passage remain, and not just physically. Arianne never thought she would be saying this, but she's a little worried about Axel. Physically, besides the hair still growing back, he was completely fine. But what about emotionally? Killing Petyr Baelish and Lisa Arryn might have given him some closure, but the wound they dealt with their actions had to be so fresh still. How are you feeling, my king? The words slip from her lips before she can really consider if it's a good idea or not. But then, why shouldn't she ask? She's to be his queen soon enough after all, once this war with the Iron Islands is done with. She and Sansa Stark both. Looking up at her, Axel smiles somewhat cheekily. Hey, better now. I saw something that no man is meant to see. Something truly horrible. But Arianne rolls her eyes, able to tell that he's only acting horrified as a lark at this point. Or perhaps as a diversion tactic. Before he can continue with his little jest, she shakes her head. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, with everything that's happened. How are you holding up? Jon Arryn was like a father to you. His loss, it's okay to not be doing all right, you know. Axel's smile drops and his expression closes off. I'm fine. He doesn't pull away from her though. Arianne stays quiet, continuing to run her fingers along his scalp. If all he wants from her is to lay here silently, then that's what she'll do. Funny, it's not the kind of thing she would have ever done for any other man throughout her life. But Axel is different, special. She can't even imagine living without him at this point. I'm not fine. Arianne lets out a soft exhale as Axel breaks the silence to admit the truth. Sighing, he shifts against her bosom for a moment before continuing on. His death still doesn't feel entirely real. And killing the people who killed him didn't make it miraculously better. I don't think even killing Euron will make it entirely right. Humming, Arianne nods along, just listening. That seems to be what he needs right now. Someone to listen. It's just, he was old, right? So I shouldn't be hurting this badly. He was always closer to death than anything. Callous words, but she can tell that they come from a place of hurt, not heartlessness. Axel's face scrunches up and tears well up in the corner of his eyes. She's never seen him like this before. So vulnerable. Still, she remains quiet. I wanted him to be able to give up the position of hand peacefully, of his own accord. Just a couple more years and I would have sent him back to the Vale so he could live out the rest of his life in his own lands, raising his son. I just needed his help for a little while longer. But I can't help feeling like, in my selfishness, I killed him. That brings a frown to Arianne's face. No longer can she remain silent. Sure, she may not have known Jon Arryn very well personally, but she knew quite a lot of the man all the same. In the end, the words that spill forth from her lips feel right. She just hopes Axel is ready to hear them. Even if you'd sent him back to the Vale, his traitorous wife would have gone with him and who knows what she would have done on Baelish's orders. Besides, would he have even gone? He loved you, Axel. He cared for you like his own son. He wanted to help you, to be there for you. Silence falls again. Axel is quiet and Arianne just rests and lets him think. Her fingers continue to glide across his scalp, the back of his head pressed up against her bared breasts. Setting aside the sex they'd already had, this has to be one of the least debauched things she's ever done in bed with a man, really. Another point in Axel's favor. But then, the differences between Axel Baratheon and any other man in Arianne's history were too numerous to count. He was just so much more than all of them. She could never go back to how she'd been before. Not after tasting what he had to offer and knowing that nobody else could ever live up to her experiences at his hands. He wouldn't have approved of me marrying both you and Sansa, you know. Am I spitting on his memory by doing this when I know he would try to vehemently talk me out of it? That causes Arianne to wince. Axel's voice is quiet and thoughtful. In trying to help him feel better and come to terms with all that had happened, had she just sunk her chances of being queen? Because really, the Dornish princess was under no misconceptions about that. She might have made a pact with Sansa Stark and agreed to work with her going forward no matter who Axel chose, but deep down inside, Arianne knew that if he actually had to make a decision, Sansa would be his queen. She was just better than Arianne in pretty much every meaningful way aside from the size of her tits. I don't think you're spitting on his memory, no. Nobody is perfect, Axel. We can both love and disagree with people, even if they're gone. Axel frowns and Arianne worries for a moment that she's failed to convince him. But then. Sometimes I think about his decisions. About his mistakes. It feels wrong. He's gone and he's never coming back, so I should honor his memory, right? But, he let Petyr Baelish play him like a fool for so long. He let Robert run roughshod over him for more than 20 years. And he was so certain that I had to hide my abilities and restrain myself as well during Renly's rebellion. But there were ways I could have handled Renly earlier without revealing too much. Things I could have done to end things so much sooner. Huffing, Axel wipes his eyes. Technically, He still hasn't shed a tear, but they had grown quite watery all the same. I just don't know what to think. I miss him so much. I want him back so badly. But there's a selfish part of me that is a little glad he's gone. I can do things my way now. I can do things he wouldn't have approved of. But what if my way is wrong? What if he had good reason for not approving of those things? Am I just a fool walking straight down the path of ruin now that I no longer have anyone to tell me otherwise? Arianne bites her lower lip, feeling a little out of her depth at this point. Still. You have me. And Sansa. As he looks up at her, Arianne smiles sheepishly. Mostly Sansa, really. She seems to have a better head on her shoulders than I ever have. Still, we'll do our best to advise you. And so will others, like Lord Stannis. Taking a deep breath, Arianne finds herself walking what she perceives to be a very thin line. Jon Arryn was a good man, who helped lesser men seem greater than they truly were. This was not always a good thing, as we now know. His good nature let him be taken advantage of by many. There is much you can take away from what he taught you, I'm sure, but there's much to be taken away from his mistakes as well. Staring into Axel's eyes, Arianne bites her lower lip for a moment before continuing. More than anything though, if he were here with us right now, I think he would say he was proud of you no matter what decisions you make going forward, and that ultimately, he would want you to be your own man and your own king above all else. Again, Axel falls quiet for a time. Again, Arianne simply stews in the silence, only able to hope that her words are having the intended impact. Until finally, the king mutters something under his breath. Quote. Even as close as she is to him, Arianne doesn't quite catch it though. I'm sorry, what did you say? Blinking, he looks up at her and huffs, smiling somewhat ruefully. I said, I decide what is proper. Don't I? Well, he's not wrong about that. Arianne grins as she glides her fingers across his scalp for the 1000th time. Indeed, my king. And apparently what you consider proper is barging into my chambers, demanding I show you my tits, and then having your way with me before nuzzling them for as long as you like. Not that I'm complaining. Axel's smile turns into a grin of his own as he finally lifts his head off of her chest and turns over, climbing on top of her. You're not wrong, but you're missing the final step. After all of that, and an unexpected heartfelt conversation to boot, what is truly proper is me fucking you again. This time doing so until you can't see straight or walk in the morning. Arianne blushes, but nevertheless spreads her legs for her king. Well, if the king says that's what's proper, who am I to disagree? He makes good on his promise too. Tyene has to help her to the balcony in the morning, where she waves goodbye to Axel as he leaves the Red Keep and heads for the city gates. She's too sore for anything else after the night of pleasure he winds up giving her. XXX. Truly, Axel has seen horrors that no man should have to witness. Fortunately, Arianne's big, beautiful tits were enough to wash away the memory of Sandor and Brienne, mostly, anyways. Chapter 61, Tyrion Lannister. Tyrion Lannister joins the story at long last. XXX. Tyrion Lannister had many regrets about life. For instance, he regretted not being in King's Landing when his brother-in-law the king had gotten himself and both of Tyrion's nephews blown the fuck up by wildfire. Maybe if he had been in the city at the time, he could have been a shoulder for Jaime to lean on and his brother wouldn't have taken his own life. He also regretted coming home to the Westerlands from where he'd been visiting the Citadel in Old Town when his father had sent a letter recalling him months ago. With Jaime's suicide and Cersei apparently going insane, Tywin had decided Tyrion was better off close by where the old lion could see him. Tyrion would have told his father where he could stick his summons, but seeing as he was rather reliant on Lannister gold, he hadn't felt like he had much of a choice. In hindsight, he almost wishes he'd done it anyways. Would have been better to be penniless down in Old Town than to be up here in the middle of all this. The dwarf further regretted being down in Lannisport the day of the Ironborn attack. In his defense, his favorite whore in all of the Westerlands worked out of a brothel in Lannisport. Also in his defense, while everyone knew that the Ironborn were likely about to make some sort of play for the Lannister fleet any day now, nobody actually thought that Lannisport itself would fall in less than an hour. Even back during the First Greyjoy Rebellion when the Lannister fleet was burnt while still at anchor, Lannisport had managed to batten down the hatches and ride out the assault from sea until reinforcements could arrive. Not this time though. Not this fucking time. Tyrion had been lucky that he made it back to Castle Rock, all things considered. Not everyone with the Lannister name had been so lucky. Their cadet branch, House Lannister of Lannisport, was said to be gutted. Meanwhile, Tyrion's uncle, Sir Kevin Lannister, had died leading the doomed defense of the city. But of all of Tyrion's regrets, his greatest regret of all had to also be his oldest regret. Namely, that he'd been born with this fucking pathetic, stumpy-legged, big-headed dwarf body in the first place, and worst still, he'd been born to the family with the most vertical fucking ancestral seat in all of the Seven Kingdoms to boot. See, not even the Eyrie had anything on the number of staircases in Castle Rock. The ring fort that sat atop the massive stone hill Castle Rock was built into was nothing but a crown for the true stronghold that lay underneath. Everything from the winding staircases to dungeons, storerooms, grand halls, courtyards, gardens, armories, bed chambers, and a sept, all of it lay down within the rock itself. There was no denying that Castle Rock was the strongest, most impregnable seat in all of Westeros. Even Euron Greyjoy and his super kraken couldn't possibly do anything to them once they'd turtled up in here. But poor Tyrion had spent his entire life in the rock, traversing its halls, and ascending its staircases on legs that were far too little for them. Huffing and puffing, Tyrion finally makes it up the stairs and down the hall to his father's study. Reaching up, he knocks for a moment before listening intently. After a moment, "Come in." Straightening his tunic as best as possible, Tyrion pries open the heavy wooden door and moves inside. He gets all of 3 feet past the door before a dry look from Tywin sends him scurrying back to close it back up. Then and only then does he approach his father's desk, where the Lord of House Lannister has turned back to the papers he's working on. Hesitantly, half expecting Tywin to order him to stand, Tyrion nevertheless takes the risk of leveraging himself up into a chair and sitting down. When the other man neither tells him off for doing so, nor so much as acknowledges his presence, Tyrion waits a moment, and then breaks the silence. "You wished to see me, father." Silence falls as Tywin ignores him for a time. Seconds drag on into minutes while he sits there, waiting for his father to acknowledge his presence. Then again, this is nothing new. Tyrion had never had the best relationship with Tywin Lannister. Mostly on account of the aforementioned regrettable dwarfism and the fact that he'd killed his own mother in childbirth. From what some had told Tyrion, mostly his spiteful sister, Tywin had actually loved his wife, Joanna Lannister. Before Tyrion, Cersei even liked to claim that Tywin smiled from time to time. And then Tyrion had come along, killed Lady Joanna in the birthing bed, and ruined everything. At least if Cersei was to be believed anyways. Jaime, on the other hand, had never seemed to blame Tyrion for their mother's death. Unfortunately, Jaime had been alone in that because while their father wasn't quite so overtly sadistic about it, he clearly hewed closer to Cersei's view of Tyrion than Jaime's. This was all to say that Tyrion had long been the black sheep of House Lannister. Physically deformed, hated by his father, barely tolerated because of the Lannister blood that flowed through his stunted body. Most other noble houses would have probably done away with him, but Tywin had too much pride for that. Although, given recent events, Tyrion had to admit, part of him was glad that he'd never had their father's love. After what had happened with Cersei, it seemed far better to start off hated by their father, rather than have his love and then lose it in truly spectacular fashion. His sister's fate. An opportunity presents itself. Tyrion jolts as Tywin finally breaks the silence and in doing so cuts off his own internal monologue. Blinking at his father, Tyrion's brow furrows in confusion. Opportunity. Castle Rock was under siege, Lannisport was in ruins, and there was a damn sea monster bigger than any Tyrion had ever read about lurking in the bay. And Tywin was talking about opportunities. Or maybe he misunderstood. An opportunity to break the siege, father. The look Tywin gives him makes Tyrion feel smaller than he already is, which is no mean feat. Sneering at him, the old lion shakes his head. Don't be ridiculous. What use are you in a war? If this were about the siege, why would I call for you? Tyrion flushes. So his first instinct had been right, Tywin was talking about something else. Of course, he couldn't very well say that was what he'd originally thought now, he would just look like even more of a fool in his father's eyes. Instead, the dwarf simply sits and stews until Tywin decides he's been humiliated long enough and finally continues on. No, this opportunity is singular to you. A chance for you to finally be useful to both our house and the realm. Straightening up, Tyrion nevertheless is just more confused than before. What exactly is his father talking about? Not marriage, surely. There isn't a woman in the Seven Kingdoms who wants to marry a dwarf. But then, what? I'm sure by now you've heard about the most recent wildfire explosion in King's Landing. We now know the perpetrator was one Petyr Baelish, the former master of coin. Blinking rapidly as he tries to catch up, Tyrion opens his mouth and then closes it again. Yes, he'd heard that someone bombed the small council in King's Landing. The rumors regarding the situation had been rather wild. For a time, nobody had been sure whether the king had died or not. Now, nobody could say for certain whether he'd been in the chambers and somehow lived anyways, or just not inside the room when the wildfire pots had gone off. The most outlandish tale that Tyrion had heard at this point was that the king had supposedly walked from the small council chambers to the great sept of Baelor while covered in green flames. There he'd apparently burned for 7 days and 7 nights before being reborn anew with not a single blemish on him. A load of bullshit, probably, but even the septons and septas holed up here in Castle Rock were preaching the story as the truth now. But his father wasn't even talking about the explosion. He was talking about the aftermath. From the sound of things, Littlefinger was dead, probably executed by the king for his crimes. Good riddance if he was actually guilty, though it came as a surprise to Tyrion, who had thought that Baelish was Jon Arryn's man through and through. The Hand had given Petyr Baelish everything. Why would the Master of Coin conspire to kill him and the rest of the small council? You will be the next Master of Coin, Tyrion. Pulled from his thoughts once more by his father's words, Tyrion's eyes widen as he fully comprehends them. Me? Surely not. There's no way the king would accept me for the position. Not after everything Cersei tried to do. Tywin scoffs at that, waving a hand dismissively. Cersei's actions aren't relevant to this situation. She is not relevant to this situation. Her madness has been dealt with. She won't be causing anyone problems again. A shiver runs down Tyrion's spine at that. Best not to think about it. Even if he hated Cersei, well, she'd made her bed, he supposed. Now she had to lie in it. You know your numbers, don't you? Tyrion flushes a bit at what had to be the most backhanded compliment he'd ever been given. He knew more than just his numbers, but he wasn't expecting his father to acknowledge that fact. Yes, but then it is settled. The 7 kingdoms assemble even now to deal with the Ironborn threat. The king and his armies will be making for the Westerlands soon. Our own armies continue to hold the roads to the east. With their pet limited to the coast, the Ironborn have no way of taking the rock from us. Tywin scoffs. If they were smarter, they would have moved on already. At this point, they will be too late to stop the royal fleet from convening with the Redwyne fleet at the Arbor. The Ironborn are just as foolish and poorly led as they were the last time this happened. As much as he hates agreeing with his father, Tyrion can't help but feel like the old lion is right. The enemy's tactics don't really make much sense. The Kraken that destroyed the Lannister fleet and allowed them to pillage and burn Lannisport was a massive asset in any naval battle to be sure, but the way the Ironborn were using it so far was lackluster, to say the least. If Euron Greyjoy were smarter, he would have immediately gone south after smashing their fleet and razing Lannisport, to take down the Arbor and the Redwyne fleet. While the Redwyne fleet was technically bigger than the Ironborn fleet, they didn't have a Kraken on their side. With that Kraken on side, the Ironborn could have destroyed the Lannister fleet, destroyed the Redwyne fleet, and then swept all the way around the southern coast of Westeros and smashed the royal fleet as well. Just like that, they would have been in control of all of Westeros' waters. And sure, maybe going all the way to King's Landing would have stretched their supplies too thin, especially since the Ironborn were notoriously bad at such things like supply chains and staying adequately provisioned, but at the very least they could have taken the Arbor by this point. That they hadn't, that they were still here trying to take Castle Rock, it was the height of foolishness in Tyrion's learned opinion. When the king and his armies arrive, you will ingratiate yourself with him. You will befriend him and do your best to make him like you. The crown still owes a considerable sum of golden dragons to our house. If I have to, I will even forgive some of that debt to get you into the position of Master of Coin. Tyrion gapes at that. Truly. What do you even want me to do if I become Master of Coin? What are you planning? Tywin narrows his eyes and shakes his head. Your job, what else? This is not some grand scheme, Tyrion. Our blood was set to sit upon the Iron Throne before this whole mess began. Now, our power and influence have both waned dramatically. You will be the first step to regaining some amount of what we lost. You will not embezzle, you will not allow corruption to take root. In fact, I want you to be everything Petyr Baelish wasn't. For a long moment, Tyrion just stares at his father. No grand scheme. No big plan. Just a small maneuver to try to regain lost influence. Was this truly his father? Had Tywin Lannister truly been so diminished by the events of the last several months? No, it abruptly dawns on Tyrion what's not being said. What Tywin is really getting out of this. This is just another way for you to sideline me as your heir, isn't it? You're getting rid of me. His father scoffs. Getting rid of you. I'm going to ensure you become master of coin. What more could you possibly want? What more indeed? Tyrion scowls, squirming in his chair. But wham. Tywin's hand comes down on the desk, causing Tyrion to jolt and fall quiet. For a moment, the dwarf sees his father's true face beneath the facade. He sees the tremble in Tywin Lannister's hand and realizes that for all he puts on a proud and implacable act, everything that has happened has truly shaken him. The loss of their fleet, Lannisport, and Kevin, all of it had only added to Tywin's growing frailty. Your sister is pregnant. The news hits Tyrion like a rock to the head. And he knows exactly how that feels. Cersei and her friends had loved throwing them at him when he was younger. You will never be my heir. You will never inherit Castle Rock. Even if Cersei doesn't give birth to a son, I would sooner name Lancel as my heir than allow you to become Lord of House Lannister. Do I make myself clear? Tyrion's mouth goes dry. He'd always known his father hated him. And deep down he'd always known that Tywin didn't intend to let him inherit. He'd just always thought that the old lion wouldn't have a choice in the end. First because Jaime was a Kingsguard and sworn to serve for life, and then more recently because Jaime was dead and Tyrion was Tywin's last living son. Only now is he given a glimpse of just how deep Tywin's hatred for him truly runs. Only now does he realize why Tywin gave up so much gold to get Cersei back to Castle Rock after everything she'd done. I said, do I make myself clear? Yes, father. Good. Then get out of my sight. Focus on preparing for the king's arrival and figuring out ways to impress him. If you're not able to secure the position of Master of Coin, then you truly are worthless to this family. Tyrion hops down from the chair and makes his way out of his father's office on short legs that feel laden down with extra weight. He really regrets being born a dwarf. But more than that, he thinks he regrets being born to House Lannister most of all. Poor Tyrion. How the fuck is he going to convince Axel Baratheon to make him Master of Coin? Chapter 62. The Gold Road. Axel and Sandor talking on the Gold Road. There's something to be said about the sizable army that Axel finds himself traveling down the Gold Road with. For all that they're moving painfully slow for someone of his capabilities, it's nevertheless an inspiring sight to see so many men working together towards a common goal. And this is just the combined forces of the Crownlands, the Stormlands, and the Mountain Clans at that. The Knights of the Vale, along with the armies of the Riverlands had joined forces by this point and were traveling along the river road towards Castle Rock in tandem with Axel's forces. Meanwhile, the armies of the Reach had split their forces. The majority of Reachmen would travel by land up the ocean road that ran all along the coast of Westeros. The rest would travel by ship from the Arbor to what remained of Lannisport, catching up once the royal fleet finished making its trip around the southern edge of the continent. And the royal fleet would in turn be stopping in Sunspear along the way to pick up a good amount of Dornish spears, promised by Prince Doran Martell himself. The North would of course be a bit late to the party, but that was through no fault of their own. Simple geography, really. Though they would be forced to wait for the Northmen all the same, because Lord Eddard Stark was bringing Theon Greyjoy with him. If it had been Balon Greyjoy who had rebelled against the Iron Throne, then Theon's life would have been forfeit for his father's crimes. That was, after all, the entire point of him being a ward of Winterfell all these years. However, since Balon had died and people were pretty sure Euron had killed his brother and usurped his seat, things were a fair bit murkier. Theon might very well be the heir to the Iron Islands, at least by the laws of Westeros if not the laws of the Ironborn. But would the Ironborn who survived the following war ever accept Theon as their leader? Asha certainly hadn't thought so and privately Axel wasn't sure either. Fortunately, he would have a chance to meet the man and get his measure in the coming days, once everyone and their armies finished converging on the Westerlands. Axel may not fully understand why Euron was so dead set on taking Castle Rock that he hadn't bothered to move from that spot in weeks now, but he certainly wasn't complaining. The Ironborn Kraken had reared back and lashed out with its many appendages, no doubt believing that it would find an easy meal in swiping away part of a school of fish that had already been damaged by another predator's actions. But it was wrong. In the end, the Ironborn Kraken had struck something bigger than itself, angering a veritable giant in the process. In the end, Westeros remained a realm united under Axel Baratheon, first of his name, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. The Ironborn were in for a hell of a time, as their idiocy had once again brought the rest of the Seven Kingdoms down on their heads. Even Dorne had been roused to action, though Axel suspected that was entirely because of Ariane's presence in King's Landing rather than any true outrage over the Ironborn's antics. Still, as eager as the young king was for the battles ahead and the chance to avenge Jon's death by slaying the final conspirator in his demise, there was nothing he could really do to make his army travel any faster than it already was. Instead, he's stuck on a horse, riding along the Gold Road under the protection of his Kingsguard. Perhaps that's why, out of sheer boredom, he turns to the member of the Kingsguard currently riding alongside him and protecting his person and grins cheekily. So, you and Brienne, huh? Sir Sandor Clegane stiffens at those words and growling comes from within his helm for a moment before he falls quiet. Axel just continues grinning, having long gotten past the horrifying memories of witnessing the two of them in sexual congress. There had been so much body hair. So much body hair. Surprised you didn't take my head for violating my vows, Your Grace. Axel tilts his head to the side at that, humming thoughtfully. If I did, I'd have to execute my entire Kingsguard, save for perhaps Sir Aris. Sandor gives him a surprised look at that, his head turning so fast Axel can almost hear the snap. Snorting derisively, the young king shrugs. You think the likes of Trant can keep his dick in his trousers? Of course not. And the men who fought with me in the trial against Renly, they're all good, solid men, each and every one. But they're still men. I turn a blind eye to any indiscretions, hell, I'd do so for Sir Aris even. For now though, he seems to be intent on staying celibate. As the scarred knight chews on Axel's words, he continues on. Besides, technically, it's not a vow of celibacy anyways. That gets another confused look from Sandor which, seriously. The man is literally a member of the Kingsguard, he's the one who swore the damn oath. Does he not see the distinction that Axel sees? Think about it, Sandor. You're sworn to the Kingsguard for life, yes. And you're forbidden from owning land, taking a wife, or fathering children, also yes. But technically there isn't anything in there that says you aren't allowed to fuck. Sandor actually looks floored, causing Axel to let out a bark of laughter. Look, so long as you aren't set on marrying the Maid of Tarth or pumping her belly full of a baby or two, it's fine. Unless. He trails off meaningfully, giving Sandor a look and then waggling his eyebrows for good measure. The scarred man shudders and shakes his head violently in response. Fuck no. It was just a fucking shag. And I wasn't stupid enough to cum in the bitch either. She just. He trails off there, though Axel can imagine what he might have been about to say. Lady, Brienne was probably the only woman outside of a brothel willing to give Sandor Clegane the time of day. And just like the rest of his Kingsguard, Sandor was only a man. Axel hums for a moment before changing the subject. So your brother is likely to be at Castle Rock by now. The hound stiffens up again, just like he always does at the mention of Gregor Clegane. But finally, he nods brusquely. He will be. Nowhere else that the old lion will let him be at a time like this. He'll be with the Lannister armies outside of the rock, contesting the Ironborn. Right. Castle Rock was under siege, but only really from the water. It was a bit of a stalemate, almost like back when Renly had sieged King's Landing. The Lannisters' forces had mustered by this point and made their way to the rock, but they couldn't fully push the Ironborn back because they were being resupplied constantly from the water and said water was inhabited by a fucking massive kraken. And so they were forced to wait, to bide their time for reinforcements. It would be when Axel and his armies arrived that shit would really kick off. Eyeing Sandor quietly for a moment, Axel grunts. My promise to you still stands. I'll kill him for you as soon as I get the chance. Unless you want to do the deed yourself now. It was always something Axel had found a little strange. The hound had to be one of the best fighters he'd ever known. And Sandor had only gotten better over these past several months of fighting Axel. Sure, he hadn't won a single spar, but the hound was the kind of warrior who saw an insurmountable challenge like Axel and kept trying, rather than so many other knights who had lost a few fights to him and then simply given up. But Sandor doesn't seem to agree that his skills had improved all that much. Either that or he just didn't want to be branded a kinslayer, because after a moment of hesitation, he shakes his head wordlessly. When he leaves it at that without saying another word, Axel just snorts and offers the Kingsguard a crooked grin. Any advice then? Should I go for the knees? His joking tone is met with a deadpan look from the scarred man. And then, something almost thoughtful appears in the hound's eyes. You want my advice, Your Grace. Sensing something beyond just their conversation about Sandor's brother, Axel waves a hand through the air. Speak freely, Sir Clegane. I promise not to punish you for telling me your mind, no matter what you have to say to me. Even with that, Sandor still hesitates for a second as they continue along the road on horseback. But finally, he finds his voice. Don't let the Ironborn off so easily this time. Or you're just going to have to do this again in another 10 or 20 years. If not you, then your heir will have to deal with their shit instead. That was one of the last things Axel expected to hear from Sandor Clegane. He had never taken the other man for being very politically minded. But the disdain in the hound's voice as he talks about the Ironborn makes it clear just how little he thinks of them. I wasn't planning on letting them off easily. Sandor gives him a look at that, one that makes Axel bristle a little bit. But he told the man to speak freely, so he holds his tongue and wordlessly gestures for Sandor to continue. Your father had Balon Greyjoy dead to rights, your grace. But he let the man bend the knee, even after his rebellion. Barely any punishment at all, and now look where we are. And you did the same with Mace Tyrell too, letting him slink back to Highgarden with his tail tucked between his legs but his seat and power largely intact. Axel opens his mouth, only for the words to die on his lips when he realizes his initial thoughts are all excuses and some variation of, well, John advised me to do so. His teeth click shut and he falls into silence, considering Sandor's words carefully. Honestly, he's more shocked than anything else that he's hearing this from Sandor fucking Clegane of all people. As if reading his mind, the Kingsguard just grunts and shrugs one of his shoulders. Been keeping my ear to the ground since you made me wear this shitty white cloak. Thought you might want to know what some people say about you. TCH. Didn't surprise him that he had detractors muttering shit behind his back. Then again, were they wrong? Was Sandor even wrong? The more Axel thinks about it, the more he finds himself questioning everything. On the subject of Mace Tyrell, maybe they should have done more to punish him and House Tyrell. They'd taken one of the man's sons from him though, along with his daughter and his mother. And of course, there were the reparations that the Reach would be paying, likely for generations given just how long a season could be. Meanwhile, it wasn't like Balon Greyjoy had rebelled again after Axel's father showed him mercy. If Asha was to be believed, then Balon had been assassinated and his position usurped. However, the rest of the Ironborn hadn't even questioned Euron taking over and leading them all right back into war. It was one thing for the man to bypass the traditional Kingsmoot with a massive fuck-off kraken. It was another thing entirely for him to get everyone on the Iron Islands to go along with him declaring himself their king and waging war with the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. The Ironborn were just waiting for another chance to revert to their precious so-called old ways, to get back to reaving and raiding and pillaging. Euron offered them that opportunity, so of course they'd rushed to follow him into his madness. What would Jon say if he were still alive? What would he advise Axel to do once he sent Euron and his kraken packing? Show mercy. Temperance, maybe. Jon had probably been the one to recommend that Robert let Balon off lightly the first time around if Axel was being honest. The Lord of the Vale had not liked to rock the boat. He'd preferred to stick as close to the status quo as he could, no matter the cost. Arianne's words from before Axel left King's Landing echo in his mind for a moment. Jon's good nature had allowed him to be taken advantage of by many other men. More even than Axel had truly realized. You're right. I can't leave the Ironborn in a position where they'll just do this all again in another generation. Something has to change. The only question was, what? What should Axel change? What should he do? Sandor just grunts beside him, staying silent. The scarred Kingsguard knows when he's given as much advice as someone of his station is allowed to give. It's not up to Sandor to figure out what to do in this situation anyways. No, that falls to Axel. Forcing Theon Greyjoy onto the Seastone chair was one option. According to Asha, her brother was viewed as an outsider at this point. A Greenlander, as she'd called it. But maybe that was a good thing. Maybe it would force the Ironborn to change. Or, maybe they'd just kill Theon in a few years and start making a mess of things again. That in and of itself was an option though. Let Theon take charge. Have him be the first sign of trouble. Come down on the Ironborn twice as hard when they inevitably killed him for not being good enough for them. Or the other option, prop up Asha instead. They wouldn't respect her because she was a woman, but they would respect her more than Theon because she was also a captain. Might actually work as a sort of stopgap measure. Only thing was, Axel didn't necessarily want to risk Asha's life in the same way he was considering risking Theon's. He was selfish like that and he liked Asha Greyjoy quite a bit. Neither option was perfect, admittedly. Still, no matter what he decided, one thing was for sure. Axel was done sticking to the status quo. He was the king of the Seven Kingdoms, and he would do what he needed to make sure everyone understood that fact. Axel did have to wonder though, what the hell was Euron Greyjoy doing focusing all of his efforts on the Westerlands? Why did it feel like the man was just waiting for all of them, both armies and fleets, to come to him? Just what was the other man up to? XXX. Next time, we find out what Euron Greyjoy is up to. Chapter 63. The Greyjoy Brothers. The Greyjoy brothers have a chat. XXX. What the bloody fuck are we doing, Euron? We've been sitting in this damn bay for weeks now. And for what? Have care how you speak to the king, brother. He is the chosen of the drowned god and the king of salt and rock. He is beyond reproach. Quiet, damn fair. I grow tired of listening to you preach. I follow the drowned god the same as everyone else. I bent the knee with the other captains. But this is folly. As his brothers Victarion and Aeron Greyjoy argue with one another behind him, Euron Greyjoy stares out at the ruins of Lannisport, and beyond that up at the currently besieged mountain fortress of Castle Rock. There was a time when he would have turned and ran Victarion through by now for the insults spewing forth from the dullard's lips, but Euron stays his hand. He controls himself. Turning to regard his brothers, Euron smiles thinly, causing both men to fall silent. A shiver even runs down Aeron's back. The youngest of the Greyjoy brothers always had been the weakest after all. Oh, but what a trio they make. There's Victarion, of course. Built like a damn bull, Victarion Greyjoy is a large and powerful man. He's also a humorless man, mostly because Euron and Aeron had spent most of their mutual childhood mocking him for his general lack of intelligence and slow wit. It had resulted in Victarion hating laughter and tending to consider any within his hearing to be mockery directed towards him. And then there's Aeron, the youngest of the Greyjoy brothers, though at this point that matters little as they're all quite old now. Aeron had nearly drowned at one point and his near-death experience had caused him to undergo a spiritual awakening. He had dedicated himself to the drowned god and become one of his priests, growing out his hair to the point of ridiculousness and earning the name, the Damnfair, as a consequence. Finally, there's Euron himself. Only one eye and more battle scars than both other men combined, and yet he still has the best looks of the three of them. He always has, to be fair. And here he is, king of the Iron Islands. But Victarion chafed under Euron's rulership. He hated that there'd been no Kingsmoot, that he hadn't been able to make a case for himself. Not that he would have won if there was one. Everyone knew Victarion Greyjoy was an idiot, save for Victarion himself. Even if things had gone to a Kingsmoot, Euron would still have become ruler of the Iron Islands. But never mind all that. Victarion was questioning him. Again. You have doubts, brother. Being directly called out causes the larger man to tense up a bit. Despite having quite a bit of height on him from when they were younger, Victarion no doubt remembers all the beatings Euron gave him back then. Or perhaps he just knows better than to truly pick a fight with a man wielding a Valyrian steel sword, wearing Valyrian steel armor, and commanding the largest kraken that the Iron Islands had ever seen. I just worry that we've wasted our edge, your grace. We smashed the Lannister fleet and savaged Lannisport easily, but that was weeks ago. We should have done the same to Aldtown and the Arbor, to Sunspear and Storm's End, all the way to Dragonstone and then King's Landing. With that kraken at our side, we would have been unstoppable. Unstoppable yes, but far from invincible. This was Victarion's lacking wits fully on display. If they'd gone with that plan, they would have wound up stretched thin to a ridiculous degree. And while the kraken that Euron commanded in the name of the drowned god was a great and powerful beast, it was only one creature. Could it have given Euron King's Landing? Perhaps, though he doubted even that. At the same time, the cost would have been to lose all of their other gains. And yet, while Victarion is being a fool, the first part of his rambling is not entirely incorrect. There was something to be said for taking the fleet south after smashing Lannisport and repeating their triumph in Old Town and the Arbor, demolishing what they could of the Redwyne fleet in the process. But Euron hadn't let them do that. He'd allowed individual captains to take their ships and reeve and raid up and down the coast for a short time, but he'd refused to move the main fleet or his kraken away from Lannisport. And eventually he'd called even those captains back here to the Westerlands. It chafes at him to have to explain himself to anyone, but Victarion, for all his stupidity, represented a sizable portion of the Ironborn. So he would tell him and trust his brother to relay the message simply and bluntly, lacking just enough detail to keep everyone else mostly in the dark. The reason we have not left Lannisport, the reason we have not attacked the Arbor or Aldtown, is Axel Baratheon. Victarion and Damfair both straighten up at that, causing Euron to smile thinly again. Allow me to tell you a story, brothers. A story of what I found in my exile. A story of why I made the long journey home. I did not merely sense Balon's impending demise, I was told by the drowned god himself that it was time to return to the Iron Islands, to take my place as the king of the Ironborn and lead our people to victory against the monster that the Seven have created. Aaron gasps in awe and reverence while Victarion scrunches his face up in confusion. But Euron simply turns away again, looking off into the distance towards Castley Rock. After a moment, he continues. The drowned god claims dominion over all oceans and seas. He is not so limited to our Iron Islands, or even this side of Westeros. It was off the coast of Volantis that he came to me and he and I made a pact. Euron's face contorts into fury then just out of his brother's view. His lips curl into a sneer and his hands clutch at the railing in front of him so hard that if not for the gloves he wears, his white knuckles would be visible. Victarion and Aaron see nothing of this of course, turned away as he is. A pact. Victarion's confusion continues. The man is truly so, very slow. But Euron nods all the same, still looking away from them. He keeps the raw emotion out of his voice, keeps from spitting the words out in a rage as he wants to. A pact. If you could call it that. It had indeed been off the coast of Volantis though. There, Euron had been enjoying the spoils of the latest captured ship in his quarters, a uniquely talented Lyseni whore who had been on her way to ply her trade in Volantis before the Silence had waylaid her transportation. And then, a kraken had come. None among the Ironborn had commented on it, but the Silence that Euron sailed now was not the same ship he'd always had. Oh, the black sails and the dark red hull were the same, but the ship was newer. Because his original ship had been sunk. A kraken had come up from below and ripped Euron's boat to shreds before he or anyone else could even blink. Everyone else died, though that wasn't important. Slaves and thralls, most of them mute, could easily be replaced. The Lyseni whore had drowned too, but he could care less about her. Euron had drowned as well. He was sure of that point. And then he'd woken up, in the depths, surrounded by the monster that ripped apart his ship and pulled him under. It was there that the drowned god first spoke to him. It was there that they'd made their accord. Not by choice, but by force had Euron Greyjoy been bound to the god of his childhood, the god of his people. The drowned god had use for him and Euron could either obey or die there in the depths. And he was loath to die in such a pathetic fashion. What kind of damned pact? Victarion's growled words are met with a snarl from Aaron as the drowned priest whips around towards him again. How many times do I have to tell you? Watch your tongue to the king, brother. Before things can devolve into yet another argument, Euron continues on, silencing both of his brothers. What other kind of pact could it be? The drowned god saw my value. He saw my strength. So he made me a deal, to sail and reeve in his name. In turn, he gave me certain advantages. And he sent me to the ruins of old Valyria to claim my greatest prize. The mention of Valyria silences both men, as Euron knew it would. Even on the other side of the known world, the Ironborn knew of old Valyria. The Valyrian steel. Those words are whispered by Aaron, making it obvious that for all his sycophancy, the priest of the drowned god has his own questions about everything that's happened since Euron returned. Euron just nods, still turned away from the other two men. I ventured into old Valyria. With the drowned god at my side, it was simple enough. I and my crew plundered the ruins, taking whatever we wanted for ourselves. And the drowned god guided me to a horn the dragon lords once used to control dragons. Dragons. Victarion's exclamation sounds downright wondrous and for a moment Euron is extremely tempted to start mocking him, just as he'd done when they were boys. Fuck, the big lug was just so stupid. He simply nods again though. The dragons are all dead, but the horn still works. And not just on dragons either. The horn is how I control the kraken. Our greatest weapon. Indeed, the drowned god had led Euron to a great treasure, one that Euron had almost deemed worthless at first. In plumbing the depths of old Valyria under the aegis of the drowned god, Euron had found nothing still breathing. Nothing but dragon bones and skeletons. Not a single living, breathing dragon still existed. Not even an egg. So the horn, well, it had felt pointless at first. But then the drowned god had ordered him to use it on his new boat, commanding him to blow it there in the midst of the smoking sea. When his kraken had first appeared, Euron had been momentarily terrified. It was easily thrice or more the size of the one who sunk his original ship, after all. And yet, it did not lash out. It did not attack him. Instead, it obeyed him. It obeyed the horn and followed Euron out of Old Valyria and all the way to the other side of the known world. Silence falls as Aeron and Victarion digest those words, but not for long. Eventually, Victarion just snorts in confusion. I still don't understand. What does all of that have to do with Axel Baratheon and giving up our damn advantage? Victarion. But this time Euron holds up a hand, cutting Damfair off. Turning back around again, he fixes Victarion with a stare, and this time the bigger man takes a full step back. Euron smiles. The drowned god has warned me about Axel Baratheon. The Seven chose him in the same way the drowned god chose me. Every rumor you've heard about him is true. Euron hadn't believed it at first, of course. But then, he barely trusted the drowned god even now. If he had his way, he wouldn't be relying on the blessings of any god. That was why he'd been willing to make his deal with Renly in the first place, just on the off chance that the drowned god could be wrong and Axel could be beaten then and there. He'd had such plans, such glorious plans, but the drowned god ruined them, dragging him down into the depths and forcing him to serve. All to turn him into a weapon and point him at this Baratheon king. Still, at this point Euron was forced to acknowledge that the warnings were true. Axel Baratheon was something unnatural. He was more than just a man, to be capable of surviving a wildfire explosion like the one Baelish had set off in the small council chambers. And that meant it was time to take the drowned god's warnings much more seriously. Victarion scowls while Aeron looks disturbed. Euron just plows onward though. Our only hope of defeating Axel Baratheon and fulfilling the will of the drowned god is to draw them out onto the water, where our deity holds greater sway than the Seven. That is why we have not burned the Redwyne fleet or sacked Aldtown and the Arbor. That is why we wait here for Axel Baratheon and his armies to approach. Turning back around again so he's no longer facing Victarion and Aeron, Euron sweeps a hand across the horizon. Once they get closer, we'll pull the fleet back and force them to come to us. They'll think they have superiority in numbers. They'll think us cowards and craven. But only on the water will we have the strength to slay Axel Baratheon once and for all. Axel Baratheon might be more than a man, but was he more than a kraken? Euron doubted it. The king, overconfident in his own immortality, would demand that they follow the Ironborn fleet out to sea even though he and his commanders would no doubt see that it was a trap. And there, Euron would have his kraken kill the Baratheon king once and for all. Once Axel Baratheon was dead, other options opened up to them. Other paths. This is the will of the drowned god. Axel Baratheon must die. Only then will we have proven ourselves worthy of being called Ironborn. Only then will we be worthy of the drowned god's favor. He sneers at his own words, knowing his brothers can't see. But even as Euron wallows in his shackles, he has a glimmer of hope. After all, the drowned god was not all-powerful. He was not all-knowing. If he were, he would never have used Euron for this in the first place. No, if their god were smarter, he would have used Damfair or Victarion. The first was fanatical enough to obey and the second was stupid enough not to even see the proverbial shackles. Euron though. Euron would do the drowned god's bidding for now. He would kill Axel Baratheon. But he refused to stop there. Sooner or later, he would find a way to kill a god as well. Then and only then would he be free. XXX. And so we learn just what's up with this story's Euron. He's basically Book Euron if he got waylaid halfway through his journeys and turned into the drowned god's mortal patsy. Chapter 64. The Westerlands. Everyone is finally arriving in the Westerlands. XXX. If he didn't know any better, Axel would say that Euron Greyjoy was trying to kill him by way of sheer frustration over being denied a proper fight. At the very least, he was certainly giving it his best shot. At long last, Axel and his armies had arrived outside of Castle Rock to break the siege and relieve the Lannister seat's garrison. To be fair, the armies of the Westerlands weren't doing a half-bad job of that themselves before they arrived, but Axel and his men along with the Riverlands and the Vale had pushed that over the edge. Except, by the time they forced the Ironborn all the way back to the ruins of Lannisport less than a mile south of Castle Rock, the truth was revealed to them. The Ironborn they routed and slaughtered nearly to the last were nothing but a token force left behind while Euron Greyjoy and his damn fleet had fled back to sea. At first, there'd been some fear that they'd gone south, to smash the Redwyne fleet after all and put Aldtown to the torch while so much of the Reach's forces had made their way up the ocean road and arrived in Lannisport. But no. The latest missives from the Arbor revealed that not a single Ironborn ship had been sighted in days, and in fact that the royal fleet had arrived by this point and were already making their way up the coast to connect with the armies outside of the ruins of Lannisport. From everything they'd been able to discern, the Ironborn fleet had retreated back to the Iron Islands, as if daring Axel to come after them. Or no, not as if. That was exactly what Euron Greyjoy was doing. Axel wasn't an idiot, and neither were most of the men in charge of his armies. It was clear as day what Euron's plan was, especially when one took into account the massive fuck-off kraken that was apparently at his beck and call. He'd gone and visited the ruins of Lannisport after they'd made sure the last of the Ironborn stragglers were dead. Axel had toured the city, wanting to see for himself the damage that Euron Greyjoy's ambitions had caused. It was interesting, the way the damage shifted depending on where you were in the ruins. On the one hand, you had the half of the city closer to land. There, it was destroyed by mere men, ransacked with doors kicked in and wooden structures burned, but non-flammable structures largely intact. However, on the other hand, you had the half of the city closer to the water, closer to Euron Greyjoy's monster. There were survivors from the destruction of Lannisport who spoke in horrified whispers of the Kraken, and Axel didn't doubt for a second that they told the truth about both its size and ferocity. However, the real proof was in the sight of Lannisport's coastal-facing walls and the sheer destruction that the part of the city next to the water had suffered. Standing among the ruins, Axel could almost see in his mind's eye the massive beast's tentacles whipping out and destroying stone walls that had stood for thousands of years. And not just the walls either. Once those had come down, the damn thing had crushed every building close enough to the sea, and given its reach, that was pretty far in, almost all the way to the city center. The stark difference between the parts of Lannisport destroyed by men and the parts destroyed by monster made it more than clear that the Kraken was very real and very large. And that, Axel suspected, was precisely what Euron Greyjoy was banking on. His enemy's strategy was plain as day, truth be told. There was no great subterfuge, no massive deception. Euron Greyjoy no doubt thought he didn't need such things. After all, in his eyes he'd probably already won. As far as Euron was concerned, it probably seemed like Axel had no good options. It was either die now or die later. The first choice, to take the combined Redwyne and Royal fleets and sail straight to the Iron Islands as his father had done years and years ago, that would be walking right into a massive trap. The Iron Fleet would be waiting, but more than that, Euron's Kraken would be waiting as well. There would be nowhere to run that far out at sea. The great big monster would no doubt destroy much of Axel's fleet, even if they did manage to kill the damn thing. And then Euron and his fleet could swoop in and clean up what remained. Alternatively, the second choice was to not chase the obvious trap. But, then what? This many men could not remain in one place, mustered and ready for battle, forever. By now, all of the armies of the Seven Kingdoms had arrived in the Westerlands. Even the North was set to arrive today from what Axel had been told. In fact, he hears a commotion at the edge of camp, and peering out, yep, there they are. As the Northmen arrive at the massive war camp, filled with tents that dot the landscape from the ruins of Lannisport all the way to Castle Rock, Axel grins. Really, he was never going to go with the second choice. That would mean disbanding these armies and sending everyone home. That would mean returning to King's Landing with his tail tucked between his legs. It would also mean allowing Euron Greyjoy uncontested control over the west coast of Westeros thanks to that blasted Kraken of his. Such a capitulation would just result in the slow death of Axel's authority anyways. Nobody would respect the Iron Throne if it could not even protect 4 of the 7 kingdoms from the predations of the Ironborn. And that was assuming that Euron wouldn't come all the way around Westeros coast just to make trouble for Dorne, the Stormlands, and King's Landing itself as well. No, the only choice was to fight. And if Axel was being honest, he was kind of looking forward to it. For now though, he catches sight of Lord Eddard Stark at the head of the column of Northmen, and he makes his way over to him, a grin on his face. Lord Stark. Blinking, Sansa's father begins to bend the knee before Axel stops him. My king. None of that now. Stand tall, Lord Stark, stand tall. Thank you for answering the call and making the long journey here. Straightening up, the older man nods solemnly. It was my duty, Your Grace. Axel's grin widens. There had been a moment, after his recovery, when he had considered other options for Hand of the King aside from Stannis. It wouldn't have been intended as a slight against the man, but rather a certain form of laziness. Stannis seemed like he'd been settling well into the position of Master of Laws, and he wouldn't have been able to keep doing that work if he was Axel's new hand. So the initial thought was to just keep Stannis in the position and find another man to be hand of the king. However, none of the men Axel had thought of to take Jon's place had felt right. Of them all, only Lord Stark had seemed even remotely reasonable, and Axel was smart enough to realize that the Warden of the North didn't want the role. Hence, Stannis had been given the title. Now, Axel finds that he has many things to tell Eddard Stark. Such as the fact that he'll be marrying his daughter. Of course, he also plans to tell the Northern Lord that he's going to be marrying Princess Arianne as well. He has no intentions of keeping such things from his father's old friend. However, before he can take the Lord of Winterfell aside and tell him anything at all, they're interrupted. Your Grace. It's a pleasure to meet you. The only reason Axel doesn't snap immediately is that the one doing the interrupting had been standing alongside Lord Stark all along. Indeed, once he inserts himself into the conversation, Eddard even turns and nods his way, introducing him. Ah yes. This is Theon Greyjoy, Your Grace. This was Theon Greyjoy. Axel looks him up and down for a long moment, taking him in. The other man straightens up under Axel's imperious gaze, the cocky smile on his face fading just a bit. He was, well, maybe it was Ash's words tainting Axel's first impression of Theon, but he couldn't help but think little of the man. There was just something about him that immediately rubbed Axel the wrong way. But it wouldn't do to let that color his reactions too much, so after a long pause, he simply nods. Well met, Greyjoy. Shoulders slumping a fraction of an inch in relief, Theon proves discontent to leave things there. Your Grace, my uncle Euron is a traitor and a kinslayer, but I swear by my ancestors that House Greyjoy as a whole does not follow him. Why? Just because of Theon himself, standing here. Axel finds himself snorting derisively, unable to hold his tongue as he shakes his head. His remaining brothers, your other uncles, certainly do. As do your people, it would seem. Theon goes a little pale. They've just been led astray, Your Grace. I swear. But Axel cuts him off, continuing his musings. Your sister doesn't though, I suppose. That causes Theon to blink, his brow furrowing in confusion. My sister. Suppressing most of his smirk, Axel nevertheless nods. Your father sent your sister to investigate your treacherous uncle's return to Westeros a few months ago. I met Asha Greyjoy in King's Landing, where she proved herself quite the fighter. Her ship sails with the royal fleet even now and should be here within the next few days. Theon doesn't seem to know what to say to that news. He blinks some more and swallows convulsively in a very visible way. Axel turns back to Lord Stark, preparing to tell the man that he wants to speak privately, but this time before he can get the words out, he interrupts himself, catching sight of someone over Eddard and Theon's shoulders. Apologies, Lord Stark, hang on to this for me for a moment, would you? The look on the Warden of the North's face as Axel pulls his crown off of his brow and sets it in the man's hands is downright priceless, but Axel pays him little mind as he walks away, moving with purpose and a glint of steel in his eyes. XXX. Ned is not used to being baffled. But as he stands there holding the king's crown in his hands, his entire body turning to follow the younger man as he walks away, that's precisely what he's feeling. Befuddlement. And then he sees where Axel is going and his eyes widen in alarm. Man, and I thought I was a big fucker. The uncrowned king of 6.5 feet in height plants himself right in the path of the infamous mountain who rides with a grin stretching from ear to ear and his hands on his hips. Sir Gregor Clegane, who had been walking through the sprawling war camp seemingly minding his own business, stops and blinks. The taller man stares down at Axel uncomprehendingly for a moment before sneering. Get the fuck out of my way. When the mountain moves to brush past Axel, however, the king reaches out and grabs him by the arm, stopping him dead in his tracks. Now hold on, friend. I just want to talk. Giant to bigger giant. Sir Clegane looks as befuddled as Ned feels by this, gazing down at where Axel is holding him as though he can't believe it. Axel, though, the crownless king, continues unabated, a cheery grin on his face. Now, I've never personally had any issues in this department myself, but I've heard that when men get to your size, they wind up losing something else in return. I just wanted to know if it was true or not. The mountain just stares, still confused but unable to pull himself free of Axel's grip from the look of things. The amount of strength that the king must be exerting. What? Letting out a laugh, Axel releases Gregor's arm and even gives him a pat. Just a simple question, friend. That height of yours, is it true that it left you with a smaller pecker than that of Tywin Lannister's dwarf son? Eddard Stark's eyes bulge out of his head at the extremely inflammatory, extremely crass insult. For a moment though, he's thrown back in time. For a moment, with Axel finally having facial hair, it's almost too easy to see Robert's form imposed over that of his son. That was, after all, just the kind of rude joke that Robert Baratheon would have made. Of course, the Mountain doesn't take it well. Despite being freed of the king's grasp, he pauses to listen to Axel's words. Upon finally realizing what Axel is implying, he gets angry. No, getting angry would be an understatement. What Sir Gregor does is let out a roar of pure rage and draw his sword on the crownless king. Ned curses, one hand holding the crown while the other goes to his sword. At the same time, some Kingsguard nearby are also reacting, drawing their own blades. They're all so far away though. And barely anyone was really paying much attention to Axel's conversation with the Mountain. And yet, none of that winds up mattering. Sir Gregor Clegane draws his sword and points it at the king of the Seven Kingdoms, but he never even gets the chance to swing it. Faster than Ned's eyes can track, Axel's own blade is freed from its scabbard before anyone else can take a step towards the altercation. It flashes out just as swiftly too, and for a moment, the camp goes quiet around them as Gregor Clegane freezes in place. After a few heartbeats, his body finally catches up with what's happened to it. The Mountain's head falls from his shoulders, rolling along the ground as the headless body drops to its knees and then slams into the ground, causing a minor quake from the sheer size of it. Axel looks down at the Mountain's corpse, no smile in sight anymore. His eyes are dark and his face is expressionless as he wipes his Valyrian steel blade clean and then sheathes it. A man would not have drawn his blade against his king. A knight would not have broken his oaths 100 times over for decades and remained unpunished. A shame that a mere dog was allowed to fool the people of Westeros for so long. Striding back over to Ned and his ward, Axel doesn't even spare Theon a glance as he takes his crown back from Ned's hands and smiles thinly. Thank you, Lord Stark. Now please, let us find somewhere more private, there are other things I must tell you. Ned spares only one more glance towards the decapitated Mountain as he follows the king away. Despite how everything had just happened, he feels like an old weight has been lifted off of his chest from over 2 decades ago. Perhaps Elia Martell and her children can rest just a little bit easier now. XXX. Ding dong, the Mountain's dead. Axel did say he would take care of that at his earliest convenience. Chapter 65. War Council. War Council time. XXX. Once Davos and the combined Royal and Redwyne fleets arrive, they all get together to hold a proper war council. Of course they do, there's too many self-important men among the armies that have assembled outside of the ruins of Lannisport for anything else. It's all so tedious in Axel's mind, but he's the king, not a tyrant. And that means making a show of listening, even if only a handful of the men that crowd the massive tent are saying anything worth his time. Though if anything else, he has to admit that the sour look on Tywin Lannister's face is uplifting. The Lord of House Lannister wasn't happy about what happened between Axel and the Mountain, but there wasn't much that he could do about it. Everyone had seen Gregor Clegane draw his sword on his king. Never mind that Axel wasn't wearing his crown, or that, Sir Gregor, didn't even get a swing off. The Mountain had drawn live steel on the king of the Seven Kingdoms and as a result he'd been put down like the dog he was, and that was that. On the flip side, Lord Stark wasn't very happy with him either. Axel had taken the older man aside and done his best to gently explain what would be happening after the war with Euron. How he would be making Sansa his queen but also Arianne as well. And how the High Septon had already signed off on it. Eddard Stark hadn't made too much of a stink about things, but Axel could tell he wasn't exactly pleased with the idea of his daughter sharing a husband with any other woman. It wasn't the done thing, even up in the north. But Axel had been quite clear that Sansa was fully on board with the idea and that Lord Stark would be welcome to come back to King's Landing with him when this was all over to try and persuade her otherwise himself. That had ultimately mollified the Lord of Winterfell, alongside Axel promising that he would happily let Sansa do whatever she wanted because her happiness was the most important thing to him. His heartfelt sincerity seemed to have resonated with the older man, at least a little bit. Of course, then there were the men in the tent who were quite happy. Or rather, one man in particular. Axel hadn't expected it, but Prince Baron Martell had come with the Dornish spears his brother had sent with the royal fleet. The Red Viper himself sat rather casually and without much care in one of the chairs surrounding the massive table that dominated the center of the tent, and he had been grinning at Axel ever since they'd assembled. Axel had a pretty good idea of why the Dornish prince was so happy with him, of course, but that didn't make the staring or the grin on the Dornish man's face any less uncomfortable. It was almost like the other man was undressing and fucking him with his eyes. Of course, there were other important men in the tent as well. Davos Seaworth, his master of ships. His counterpart, the Redwyn admiral whose name Axel hadn't bothered learning. Lord Paramount Edmure Tully, leading the armies of the Riverlands. Axel wishes it were the Blackfish, truth be told. Lord Randall Tarley, leading the armies of the Reach Mace, had been smart to stay home and out of Axel's sight, in all honesty. Cowardly, but also smart. And many, many more than that too. There had to be easily 50 men in the crowded tent, though the ones just mentioned were the vast majority who actually got a seat at the table close to Axel himself. Everyone else was relegated to the other end of the table or forced to stand. All the while, Esser Aris and Esser Sandor flanked either side of Axel's chair. A proper war council, with everyone wanting to make themselves heard. Axel just wished they weren't just repeating all of the things he'd already thought of himself. Euron Greyjoy is a coward. He flees at the first sign of our forces. It's a trap, obviously. He means to draw us out to see where that monster of his can scuttle our fleets and drown us. Bah! Between the Royal and Redwyn fleets, we outnumber the Ironborn boats 3-1. A single Kraken isn't going to turn the tide of battle against us. We'll crush it in this upstart Greyjoy, just like last time. You haven't seen the Kraken in question. It's bigger than anything that's ever been recorded on this side of the narrow sea. It destroyed the walls of Lannisport and then half the city besides. I can't help but wonder if our scorpions will be able to so much as pierce its hide. On and on they go, round and round in circles. Everyone wants to say their piece. Everyone wants to be heard. Of course, the smarter men at the table hold their tongue and speak only when absolutely necessary. But the rest jabber constantly, as though rehashing the same exact points over and over again will change anything. He's probably let them all talk long enough, right? Lord Davos has already given his opinion. So has the Redwyn admiral. Both men knew more about boats than anyone else in this room, including Axel. However, neither had actually laid eyes on the Kraken that Euron Greyjoy was said to command. Still, Axel knew that they'd both been to the ruins of Lannisport by now and seen the damage wrought by the Kraken's appendages. And even then, they were both cautiously optimistic about being able to kill the beast, and that was without knowing what Axel was capable of. But really, even if they weren't, there was only really ever one option, wasn't there? Enough. When he finally decides to speak, Axel's voice cuts through the clamor like Valyrian steel through flesh. Word of what happened in King's Landing has reached the ears of every man in this room by now. Some, he suspects, still don't believe it. Some do and look at him with either fear or reverence in their eyes. They've also all heard about the incident with the mountain by now. Only Tywin is truly upset about Gregor Clegane's death, but there's certainly a degree of wariness in the men as he speaks, everyone going quiet and turning to look to him, their king. Axel smiles thinly, his eyes flinty as he looks them all over. There is no choice. Are we to cower away in our castles and let Euron Greyjoy rip the Seven Kingdoms asunder? Are we to hide from his Kraken as he lashes out at our coasts without reprisal? Lannisport first, what next? Aldtown, the Arbor, Sunspear, perhaps bolder still. Perhaps Storm's End, or Dragonstone, or King's Landing itself. The mood in the room becomes more somber with each place he names. Even a Baron Myrtell's ever-present smile dims when Axel mentions Sunspear as a target. No. The combined might of the Seven Kingdoms stands ready to nip this threat in the bud here and now, as it did years ago under my father against another Greyjoy entirely. To turn back now would be worse than folly, it would be cowardice. Asha and Theon are both in the back of the tent, though not next to one another. Axel notices Theon squirm as several people look his direction at the mention of his father's rebellion. Asha gets the same treatment, but she stands tall and proud, having eyes only for Axel. He gives her the smallest of nods before turning his gaze to Davos and the Redwyn admiral. He probably should ask the man's name, but at this point, doing so would ruin all of his momentum. Instead, he gestures to both men. My master of ships and his counterpart from the Arbor have my utmost confidence. They shall work together to form a proper plan for the voyage ahead. Once they're done, we will depart and bring an end to this rebellion once and for all. Silence falls over the tent. Many look like they have something to say. But none actually try and say it. In the end, Axel gives them all plenty of time to speak up. When nobody does, he waves a hand through the air. This council is over. Everyone begins filing out of the tent. Well, almost everyone. It's not long before Axel, still seated at the head of the table, is disturbed by Sir Aris leaning down to murmur in his ear. Your Grace, there are men asking for an audience. One of them is a Baron Martell. The other is Tyrion Lannister, the imp of Castle Rock. Axel furrows his brow, wondering why Tywin Lannister's only living son would want to speak with him. In the end, he shakes his head. Send in the prince. When it comes to people he wants to talk to, anyone from House Lannister is going to be naturally lower on the list than the uncle of one of the women he intends to make his queen. Even if the Red Viper had been making strange eyes of Axel throughout the entire fucking war council. A moment later and the Dornish prince strides back into the tent, grinning from ear to ear. He walks right up to the chair he'd been sitting in before, just a couple down from Axel himself, and drops himself back into it, lounging there as he gives a perfunctory bow of his head. You have my eternal thanks, Your Grace. And the thanks of Dorne as well. Axel smirks and shrugs, being blunt and honest. I didn't do it for you, Prince Martell. I didn't even do it for Arianne. But of course, a baron isn't even fazed by that. He grins, shaking his head. No, you didn't. You did it for the man behind you, didn't you? Of course he'd heard. No doubt Nymeria and Obara were reporting to their father the entire time. Even as Sandor Clegane bristles at his back, Axel just sighs and shakes his head. The mountain was not worthy of the gifts that the seven gave him. Most of all, he was not worthy of the air he continued breathing. I took his life because most of all, he did not deserve to continue living. Silence falls for a moment before a baron slowly nods, looking impressed. Well said, Your Grace. Well said, indeed. You know, my paramour and I would love to host you in our tent later tonight for some wine. Elaria has just been dying to meet you, the bastard who became king. There's a suggestive lilt in a baron's voice that has Axel narrowing his eyes in response. So those looks earlier, he wasn't just imagining things. Finally, he decides to just be truthful with the man. You would not enjoy that very much, I don't think. A baron's smile becomes a bit more rigid, a hint of confusion entering his eyes. Oh. Axel just smiles thinly. I do not lay with men. And if I were to bed your paramour, you would no longer be able to satisfy her. No other man would feel the same after I got through with her. A baron's eyes bulge out of his skull a little bit at Axel's boast. The thing is, it's not empty. He means every word and he thinks the Red Viper can tell too. After a long moment, a Baron Martell chooses to throws his head back and laughs. Axel lets him get it out of his system before continuing on. Besides, it would not be proper seeing as I intend to marry the princess and make her my queen. Now that gets a baron's attention. More than that, Axel can tell he's managed to surprise the Dornish prince for the first time. Oh. That is glorious news, Your Grace. So Tywin wasn't informing on him to a baron like Obara and Nymeria were. How very interesting. Indeed. Once Euron Greyjoy is dead and the Iron Islands are pacified, I will return to King's Landing and marry both Princess Arianne and Lady Sansa in the light of the Seven. You are, of course, invited to the wedding. To his credit, while a baron is once again shocked by Axel's words, he doesn't do anything so foolish as claim that the faith will never let him marry two women or something like that. Instead, with a considering glint in his eye, the Red Viper finally rises from his chair and gives a proper bow. I concede, Your Grace. You have managed to astound me more times in a single conversation than any other man can boast. I must rescind my offer of wine, if only to protect my paramour from your seemingly insatiable lusts. Aris and Sandor both bristle a bit at that, but Axel just smirks, taking the comments in the spirit they are given. A baron's words might seem insulting on the surface, but in actuality, Axel got the impression that he was really being complimented. He waves the other man off with a hand and watches as Sir Aris escorts him out for a moment before returning with a frown on his face. Tyrion Lannister still waits outside, Your Grace. Truly. Well, that was a minor point in the imp's favor, Axel supposed. Very well, bring him in. A few moments later and the dwarf steps into the tent. He's certainly something to look at. With mismatched eyes of green and black, thin flaxen hair, and a stunted body but a rather large forehead, he was, well, unnatural was one word for it. But then to be fair, Axel was just as unnatural if not more so. He was just lucky enough to be handsome and tall. His unnaturalness hid beneath the surface, while Tyrion was forced to wear his on the outside for all to see. Unlike a baron, Tyrion doesn't wait to bow. The littlest Lannister immediately bows at the waist, massive head all the way down. Your Grace, it is a great honor to finally meet you. Axel stays quiet, not having much patience for Lannisters. Not after Tywin Lannister played games during Renly's rebellion and not after finding out Cersei Lannister had been trying to kill him all his life. Still, their actions were not Tyrion's actions. Finally lifting his head, the dwarf seems to hesitate for a moment, before forcing a bright smile onto his face and clasping his stubby hands behind his back. I simply wished to thank you, my king. Thank him. For what? You didn't have to defend my honor so viciously when you beheaded the mountain, but I must say, I will appreciate it forevermore. For a long moment, Axel doesn't get it. But then he recalls the words he'd spoken to Gregor Clegane in order to get the larger man to draw his sword on him and justify his death. Specifically, he'd claimed that the mountain's cock was smaller than that of the dwarf now standing in front of him. Axel can't help himself. A bark of laughter leaves his lips and he finds that he approves of the littlest Lannister just a bit more than he did previously. For all that he's stunted and malformed, Tyrion Lannister seems to have a sharp mind and a sharper wit. Grinning now, he inclines his head in Tyrion's direction. Your gratitude is accepted, Tyrion Lannister. I do so like a man who enjoys a good jest. Seeing him in a good mood, Tyrion dares to move closer to the table, until he can rest one arm on it and tap away with his stubby little fingers. I'm glad to hear it, my king. Here's another then, me as master of coin. Axel pauses, his good humor departing as quickly as it's arrived, his eyes narrowing as he regards Tyrion more coldly. Your father sent you. The dwarf offers him a wan smile, one that shows he knew exactly how this would go over with the king. And yet, he's making a go for it anyways. Yes, your grace. According to him, I'm not much use for anything other than numbers. And the position is currently empty, so it would seem to be the perfect fit. He finds it hard to hate Tyrion Lannister. But that doesn't mean he's going to just capitulate to something like this. Axel is already shaking his head, ready to reject the idea entirely, when another thought comes to mind and he stops. Leaning forward, he looks Tyrion right in his one green eye. The crown still owes your house far too much gold for me to consider putting a Lannister in charge of that very debt. Go and tell your father that the only way I'll consider you for master of coin is if he forgives the rest of the debt beforehand. All of it. Down to the last copper star. Tyrion's jaw drops open. That's almost 1,000,000 golden dragons, your grace. Axel smiles thinly as he sits back in his chair. He might not hate Tyrion, but that didn't mean he was going to let himself be manipulated either. It is, yes. Now go. Tell your father. I'll give him until I'm back with Euron Greyjoy's head to make a decision. Goodbye, Tyrion Lannister. Swallowing thickly, looking like he wants to say more but is clearly too smart to outstay his welcome, Tyrion bows again and departs from the tent as quickly as his stubby little legs allow. Axel watches him go for a moment before shaking his head. At least Tywin had kept Cersei Lannister well away from him so far. Axel didn't know or care where the woman was at this point so long as he didn't see a single glimpse of her while he was here in the Westerlands. Their departure for the Iron Islands couldn't come soon enough. XXX. Tyrion has his first encounter with Axel. It didn't go too badly, truth be told.